Hey everyone, I'm Trent Kusters, co-founder and studio director here at League of Geeks, and you're listening to The Game Maker's Notebook. Today I'm chatting with Brian Bucklew and Jason Grinbalt, co-founders of Freehold Games and co-creators of a game that's had its claws into me for the last couple of weeks, Caves of QUD. We start talking about their early game memories, playing RPGs, tabletop RPGs at Brian's place. We talk about some of their early video game inspirations. Then we pretty much get into how they fell into professional game dev through a game jam competition. And Jason lays out the timeline and major milestones of their 17 years. That's right, 17 years developing Caves of QUD. Early technical challenges contrasted with the challenges they face today. Stories from the roguelike community and their early days and involvement in that. Brian's grand ambitions and experiments building a roguelike engine that could finally do what they had ambitions for in the genre. We talk a lot around modular design and Jason's thinking about content and systems as a kind of Lego block and the benefit that that brings to gameplay. They share a lot of their experience and wisdom in managing the balance of authored RPG content and generative roguelike elements and storytelling content. Huge achievement there in this game. It's one of the most standout pieces of it. And then what friction in design means to them and when it can be valuable. Really great lessons in there too. And then we talk about things like how the game has changed as they changed over the course of those 17 years and how they continued on in the face of all the kinds of personal and professional challenges that occur to a couple of people in that kind of time frame. And finally, we end the podcast when I ask Brian and Jason what the one philosophy is that they would pass on to you, our listeners or other developers, from their 17 years developing QUD and the kind of cultural achievement they've had here. And I really do mean this. Like, I don't hold my cards close to my chest in this episode at all. QUD is probably my game of the year. I've had such a blast with it. It's such a stellar achievement. And like happens a lot of years in video games, it's kind of for me come out of left field. I've known about it for many years, but it's so disarming and so brilliant and it executes so well on what it tries to do. And the ambition there is just astounding. So huge recommendation to check it out if you haven't. And of course, I really do hope you enjoy this episode. I had such a pleasure chatting with Brian and Jason. Enjoy.
I wake to the warmth of the waxing salt sun, and before I draw breath, it sidewinds to the beetle moon. I muse on my many selves, think on the jewels I've loosened from the lime, and all the myriad forms space and time have lathed me to. I dream of the sky shelf and its cosmic tilt, the movers that ferried strangers across stellar gulfs and toward their numinous ends. The earth falls away to light and dust, and I dream no more. Now we become the specters that peopled the caves of QUD.
Brian, Jason, thank you for joining us today on the Game Maker's Notebook.
Thanks for having us. We're super happy to be here. We're both, I think, kind of blitzed from launch year or something. I mean, it was a long time, so we're just here to hang out.
Yeah, hell yeah. When was the V1.0 release? It wasn't too long ago, right?
12 days.
12 days. Okay, right. See, this is the interesting thing, right? I actually was not prepared for that answer because time is a construct or a concept for me, really. It doesn't have any, it's a flat circle, as they say, because I've been spending those 12 days basically in the world of QUD. That's been where I've been living for the last 12 days. So that's a surprise to me even.
I can't believe anyone plays it. It's like it's such a weird little thing we made from just being weird little goblins.
Yeah, we've been saying because it started as for so long it was a hobby project, and even before that it was like a pre-hobby project. It was just like a fever dream of Brian and I, and with our friends we would sort of hash out the type of game we'd want to make, and to be here now after this, it really is just a giant milestone. 17 years we've been working on the game, and for it to actually be at what we called 1.0, it's many times did not think we would necessarily get here in our lifetime, at least. So to be here is pretty wild.
Yeah, it's one of those things, it's often said, like, whether it be starting a company or a big project like this, like, when you get to the other side, if you ask yourself whether you would do it again, like, knowing everything that it's like, no, I didn't know it was going to take 17 years, or the naivety or whatever. Do you have that sort of feeling about it yourself, or you're like, I'd live it, or is it the Nietzsche thing, like, I'd live it all over again, endless times, demon, give it to me?
I think it was I think it was pretty great, in part because for most of that time, except for like the last couple years, I never felt like there was a sort of Damocles hanging over me to release it. It was
yeah, right.
It was most of that time was us thinking, oh, we're just working on it for fun and it's rad and it's cool that 15 people are playing it and we're enjoying hanging out with those 15 people. And then we were, oh, maybe we'll make $1,000 on Steam from it. And so like there were never aspirations for it. And so at each tier where QUD surprised us, it was always this like, wow, that's amazing, rather than something I felt like I was grinding towards. And 1.0 is kind of the same. It was a little more intense than the rest, but it's still just, I can't believe what it's doing. Like, this thing is just a monster on its own, and it's fun to watch it kind of like wreck a city.
But I do think you're right. Like, yeah, I agree. It has been like, I mean, I kind of would do it again because it was so, I feel lucky to be able to be in this position, to be working on this thing that we are is just so our thing, and have it be so well received. But at the same time, I think you're right in that we probably wouldn't do it again because there are all these ambitions that, looking back on, were silly. Like, there's just like the unconstrained scope and the things we thought we'd be able to add, and like just the scale of the project itself is something that I don't it's hard now, having done it and knowing what big projects like that entail, having the energy and the naivety to sit down and say, like, I'm going to do this. I think you do have to not know what you're getting into to start this type.
Oh yeah, would I do it again right now? No.
Yeah, there's no fuel for inspiration like naivety, for sure, right? Like, that'll get you off the couch and started on a 17-year game dev project any time of day. All right, well, look, that's perfect foreshadowing for, like, going right back to the start and everything that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to do that. But before we do that, I do want to give our listeners just a bit of context about the game that we're talking about here today, that we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about, because you developed two games, obviously Sproggywood, and then you've got Caves of QUD. But Jason, maybe you can just give us the sort of elevator pitch, as you would call it, for Caves of QUD, or just for our listeners, explain to them what this game is that you've created that we're going to spend so much of our time talking about today. And then after that, we'll take it right back to the start where it all began for you two as kids.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it is a weird one, so it is hard to give the one pitch on, but I have a few things I tend to say, which is like, it's a science fantasy roguelike indie RPG, open world and built on a lot of simulation. And it tends to has like a kind of offbeat, weird, sort of cross-genre setting. So a lot of people reference Morrowind, the kind of feeling of being in a sort of alien world that Morrowind imparts, as opposed to maybe some of the other Elder Scrolls, which cleave a little closer to what we expect from like a Tolkien derivative fantasy. And we're, that makes us happy because we're big fans of that game. That game is a big inspiration for us. So if you think of this weird science fantasy open world that's pulling from a lot of resources, the gameplay itself is like this kind of tactical turn-based roguelike gameplay that, you can think of like the roguelikes like Ancient Domains of Mystery or NetHack, but also things like XCOM. There's just like that kind of turn-based tactical thing going on. And then kind of under the covers, there's also this simulation, and where we took a lot of inspiration from something like Dwarf Fortress. So we have, or you could think of Minecraft as a touchstone, right? There's physical simulation going on. You can dig a tunnel anywhere in the world. You can freeze rivers to ice. But then there's also that we really got into this like social simulation, this historical simulation. We generate some history. And then that informs your instance of the game world. So, all that kind of comes together into the stew to produce Caves of QUD.
I think it's also important to note that Jason is very writerly. So there's also like a couple books worth of sci fantasy prose and poetry that you might have pulled out of the 60s and 70s, right? Like new wave science fiction stuff in there. So even if you're just there for science fiction prose, there's so much in there that
Oh yeah.
Jason and Kalen have written.
Yeah, it's just there's a few achievements that, again, I'm going to foreshadow that we'll get into later on, that really stand out for me. Is like the roguelike RPG, the Morrowind huge spanning adventure is just gargantuan. You know, like it's bewildering how big the world feels when you get into it. I think also there's something to be said about the presentation of the game. And like, you know, I think some, like, people might look at it and think of Dwarf Fortress and be like, oh, it's an ASCII art game, but it's not actually, right? It's like, it's sprites, like 2D sprites, and something more akin to, like, you know, a game out of the 80s or the early 90s or something like that, right? But it's just done so well, and especially with V1.0 and the new UI, like there's a kind of, and you know, the gamepad controls, which we'll get into as well, there's a kind of a reaching out from this incredible niche that so many people don't have access to, and you've kind of like put a accessible hand out there for so many people, like to bring them into the experience. And the other thing too that I really like, the simulation stuff is obviously incredible, the procedural generation of like so much of like the narrative and everything, but the actual written prose and the world that you've created is just such a magical thing. So much to dive into there for sure. All right.
I think I would like to say that QUD doesn't harken back to a specific era. You'd say it feels like something from the 80s or something from the 90s or something from ASCII. And I would say it's none of those things. It's a really like almost a hauntological instance of what a video game from the past might feel like through modern vibes, right? Like you've never played anything like it. You won't play anything like it again because you're kind of, it's very strange if you make something like that now, right? But to me, it feels like the way I imagined games being in the future when I was playing a game in like 1983, right? Like what might a video game be like through a modern lens? And so it's not playing a game from 1983, but rather casting that kind of game through 40 years of lived experience with video games and the different route that it took in the real world.
What an absolutely brilliant way to articulate. I couldn't agree more. It absolutely feels like that for sure. All right, let's take it all the way back. So as you may know, we start this podcast trying to get a hold of that, a little glimpse into that first spark of joy for video games for both of you. You know, like what kicked off this obsession that's led you to making this your lives and your careers. Do you have a memory from childhood, the both of you? Let's start with you, perhaps, Jason.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Well, it's fun because Brian and I grew up together. I mean, I met Brian when I was 12, I think. And Brian's was the house where you went to play games because Brian had. I actually didn't have a computer at the time. Brian had a computer. He had all these wonderful games. It was like it really opened that world to me. I mean, before that, I was, I played the consoles. I was always like, like a kid who was born in the early 80s, like this was, this was pretty standard. We had Atari, we had Nintendo. And, always the science fiction fantasy, like imagination and was there with me. And that's the stuff I was drawn to. And when I came into contact with like Legend of Zelda, et cetera, et cetera. I do think of like my time of when I met Brian and when I was kind of exposed to this broader spectrum of what was happening in like the collision between that science fiction fantasy world and software and games at the time, and also tabletop is really where I was introduced. At Brian's house, I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons and to Gamma World and to the Elder Scrolls and to Might and Magic or whatever, like and just like that's really where I kind of fell into the deep hole. And then at the same time, at that age, I'm getting exposed to a lot of I'm reading a lot. I'm getting exposed to some of the weird science fiction and fantasy that ends up informing the game. So yeah, that's kind of that's the mix for me.
Love it. And so, Brian, I imagine there's crossovers. You're named in that statement a number of times, right?
Yeah, to me, that's a little bit later. I got started earlier in the 80s. My father was taking a computer science class in college at the time, and he didn't end up going into computers. But for that class, we had an Apple IIc, and my first experience in video games was earlier than that, playing games on like the TRS-80 and like the Atari 2600. But then really getting into it in the world of Apple II games, playing games like Pool of Radiance and Wizardry, and being able to crack open like Byte magazine and type in a bunch of programs from the back of it and get them kind of working. Those games to me were my intro. And I think especially Pool of Radiance really just blew my mind. I mean, I was like, I must have been 9 or something, right? And that's like a whole world with secrets and a world map and, you know, like a little town. And I think I'm still infected by that game today and its ambition in those tiny computer worlds. It showed me that like, wow, you can do so much with so little by just gesturing at this world, right? And have it live in your mind. And it still gets me today, I think.
I think the today's modern 3D development pipeline really kind of puts developers on a path with any game, even from the conceptual phase, like right out of the box a lot of the time, you know. And I think a lot of the, you know, especially some of the larger studios or the ways that games are made at scale, they point us in a particular direction. But back then, when everyone was obviously rolling their own engines, you know, from scratch, and it's like, I have this ambition or I have this fantasy that I want to craft for my players. The kind of games that you're talking about, the ways that you interacted with them, the ways that they were presented to the player, the perspectives, like there was just such a range of beauty. Obviously, there's so many games being released these days. It's not like you can't find them now, but it seemed like so many of the mainstream games back then just went off in these beautiful, brilliant directions that you were just completely bewildered at times by the breadth of their fantasy, so to speak.
Well, and I also think that at the time, like Pool of Radiance, you look back at now and you say, oh, that's a standard WCRPG. But that didn't exist before Pool of Radiance, right? Like
coming the names for it, yeah.
Yeah, like that was the first time anyone had really ever done that in such a cohesive form. They did it inside the Dungeons and Dragons box. They did it beautifully, right? Not all of these games were exploring forms that hadn't frozen out into these narrow commercial verticals, these narrow genres that are well defined, right? There's lots of reasons that happens, not only commercial, but because we all know when you build a game, it's really hard to change a piece of that structure without a bunch of surprising side effects that are not all positive, right?
Totally.
But like those games like Hillsfar, right? Like that were just weird packages of interactive tools that like even later in the 90s you had like Fantasy Empires and what were some of those other games? They're just like what would today be very strange combinations of genre. Just people trying to Lego them together and see what works, right? Yeah. And some of those things like still ring true, and some of those things are still like out there experiments. But sitting down and not knowing you were going to get this specific genre was such a fun part of those games, right? It really felt unknown. You didn't know like even what piece of the UI would be clickable, right? Like what's going on, right? Like this gargoyle does something when I click on it. I don't know. That's weird.
Yeah, there's like interactivity affordance as well with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and like what you were saying about like, you know, we didn't have the rendering power that we did then, and that constraint of the medium, you know, kind of forces you when you're building a game that's trying to like construct a fictional world to do more sort of like gesturing than like precise line work, so to speak, right? And that produces a certain effect. And that's why, you know, like if you look at our game is you gestured at it, like it's kind of 2D sprites. It's a very lo-fi. Like, I mean, some people do kind of, that is challenging for some people. Yeah. And on the one hand, it is in a part because we like if either Brian or I were like really, I mean, Brian is actually a good visual artist, but like if any of us, if that were our main thing, maybe the path we took down games would look different. But because it wasn't, I think like we leaned into this idea of like, oh, you can actually gesture at a lot more. It's not just a limitation to not have high fidelity art, right? In fact, it affords you this ability to say like, hey, we have this abstract kind of evocative sprite that is designed to only be part of the picture and for your imagination to complete the rest. And that allows us to say, actually, your character now has 2 heads and not 1 head. And for you not to feel the friction of that in the same way you would if you were looking at a 3D model and I was tell you the same thing, right? Like
Mm.
there's a lot, that's really where so much of our work and our approach sort of flowers, in that negative space between what we can do and what we can't do.
Yeah, and some one of the things that I've been thinking about as a big fan of, RPGs, and especially a lot of the ones you mentioned, like Morrowind has got to be like my all-time Elder Scrolls. I love it. But thinking on your game and what you've managed to do with the abstraction and the ability to have the player project so much of the world in their mind into it, like it's akin to reading a novel, right? Like I'm playing QUD, but the world is in my brain, like it's in my mind, like I'm there. You're just teeing up the ball for me to spike it kind of visually. And I'm thinking of that, that Matrix scene where he's like blonde, businessman or whatever, he's looking at the code and he's like, after all these years, I don't see that. I don't see the code. I just see, and I feel the same way. Like when I walk away from QUD and I think about it, I don't see it the way that it's presented on screen. I see it as these vast jungles with, like ape mares and like age-old robots like rusted up to the hilt with wings, and it's really magical, the degree of projection that you've managed to elicit from your players from the degree of abstraction that you have. And as you say, Jason, it's because of it, it's not in spite of it. Yeah.
Well, it uses a particular technology, which is a literary technology, right? It's funny because like a lot of modern players are very put off by this because this isn't a technology that's used, but it's a technology that lots of us experience. You read a book, you don't think about the letters, right? Like you're not thinking about, like sometimes you do, like that's a very cool A. But it's very rare that you're like really thinking about, like the typography of the book when you're thinking about the book. You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about the world that it's generated in your world, right? And I think QUD approaches rendering from that perspective, taking the technology that literature provides to get that world into your brain instead of the technology that like NVIDIA provides, right?
Yeah, you've kind of almost pointed out the lunacy or the funny nature that we actually talk about these things even within video games. It's not like there's a literary podcast where people get together and go, I'm looking at Garamond on the page, but I'm seeing this incredible scene unfold in my mind.
I'm sure this conversation happened in like 14900 BC where people are like,
right.
I'm seeing charcoal on the wall, I'm thinking buffalo, and that is blowing my mind right now, right?
I love it. And look, we're going to get more into this because I have like the flavor text in this game is unlike anything I've ever seen. And I've written thousands and thousands of lines of like flavor text, whether it be for cards or items or whatever in my career. And I just like, you've knocked me flat on my back, like with some of this flavor text. It's just incredible. And there's so much stir to it. So I've actually got something I'm going to read out at some point, but I'm going to get back to our timeline. So another game that I listened to you guys talking about on a podcast with its developers at one part, or it was actually a stream, was Urcon Masters, which is like a deep cut, considered one of the, the greatest games of all time, really. And there's some parallels as well to your game and like the community involvement, in regards that you've seen from the modding scene and the engagement and these 15 players that you're talking about who are so engaged with them as well. Was that game, it seems like that game was a bit of an influence as well for you too.
Huge influence, very big influence. One of the, like, if I had to list, it's probably in the top 5 of, at least for me, and probably for Brian too, because he's who introduced me to the game ultimately. But and I think in particular the thing that game does, which I feel like we try to do and we do to some degree, is one, it's a beautifully written game. It stakes out this really interesting, like, I still think about the Urquan. Like, they're just like probably my all-time favorite like science fiction game villains.
Yeah.
And just really thoughtful, interesting science fiction world building, but at the same time can just veer into the goofy and the silly and like the fun and the zany in a way that like I constantly try to like impart this when I'm talking about QUD, but also other media, is that like we are very good in our head as readers and as players at holding a very dynamic and sometimes self-contradictory fictional world.
Mhm.
And, I think of like the times in like Twin Peaks as a touchstone I use for this, where it could be like deeply serious and tragic and dramatic, but also veer into the goofy. And it's not like we can handle that, right? We can handle those like down and up keying between registers really well. We have very like robust fictional engines in our brains, and that I feel like, when people talk about QUD, sometimes they lean deep into what, like, how zany it is, and sometimes they lean deep into like, oh wow, there's a lot of real cool prose and texture in here that like I'm getting something more serious out of. And I love both of those notes. I think QUD hits both of those, Star Control 2 hit both of those really well. And the two are kind of mutually reinforcing. Like, I think the two, when you're producing something that is world-like, the world is a weird, dynamic, messy, and like multi-key place, right? And so I think hitting those multiple notes is kind of a part of developing a big world.
I think that, and I was going to make that point. Like, if you're doing world building on a large scale, right? There's plenty of reasons you choose to be monotonal in world or story building. But if you're really trying to say, I'm going to fabricate a world that feels real, that is big, contains the whole multitudes of a world. The world's a weird place where very serious and very silly things happen simultaneously, and often you're laughing your ass off while the worst thing happens because some ridiculous thing has also happened too, right? Like, that's just the way the universe is at like a really fundamental level.
Yeah.
And even one more note that, I feel like we've gotten into this before in other discussions, but one note maybe we haven't gotten into is that what I noticed is that, and what I feel myself as a I don't want to say consumer, because as someone who reads or writes or reads or plays or whatever, is that we just love the genre swerve. We really love when one thing is expected to happen in with like the context of the genre that we're reading or playing in, and then something else happens. Or at least there is a type of person who really likes that, myself included. So when you get the roguelike that has really interesting prose, that's already something, right?
Yes,
when you get the Western that goes deep into, like metaphysics or something, that there's something there. We're able to like read. I think, you take all the text in Caves of QUD and you post it to a website, it's much less interesting than it embodied in the game world that is actually something else first, right? Or at the same time.
Yeah, I found myself thinking I would read a fucking book about this game, but then I was immediately afterwards, I was like, no, that's missing the entire point here. Like, that's these, as you say, this text exists as a part of this huge construct that is like propping up either like every end of it and every part of it. Genre swerve as well is a wonderful, wonderful phrase for that I've not heard. It's like, it's not the genre mashup, but it's like almost the delayed, the subversion of the genre, right? Like, yeah.
I also think a lot of QUD lives in the lacuna between little lights, right? And I think the roguelike framework is like the Christmas tree on which the little ornaments are dangled, right? And the way that they're arranged on the tree is part of the story being told, right? And if you were to just remove the tree and like look at the ornaments, it's not as cool. It's like a box full of ornaments, right? And that spacing between them is a meaningful part of it, because part of what's fun about QUD is filling that in, and everybody's going to fill that in differently. And so like, I think a lot of the meaning comes from that. What you might look at and like, oh, look at this boring roguelike about combat, right? And instead, that's kind of the branches on which you dangle the meaning.
Yes, totally. All right. So this time in your childhoods that you're playing, like these games that you mentioned, Dungeons and Dragons, the Satanic Panic is in full swing at Brian's house, right? You're playing D&D in the basement.
Let me jump in right there, because this is very meaningful, is that the Satanic Panic was in fact in full swing in my house. I grew up behind the biggest Seventh-day Adventist church in the Midwest, on church grounds where my parents were caretakers. And I very much could not play Dungeons and Dragons because the books would really start talking to me with demons. And so I was, however, able to buy Gamma World because that was not demonic. And so instead of buying
Ah,
Dungeons and Dragons, my first role playing game was Game World. And I think if you played Caves of QUD, you can see that was like an extremely meaningful first exposure to role playing games. Because while we played a full breadth of games like Dungeons and Dragons and Rifts and Deadlands, like that whole era of games, Game World was a lot of our first games as 12, 13, 14, 15 year olds sitting around and going like, oh, I'm making procedural weird tortoise guys spinning through time, and that like will bend you up when you're a 14-year-old, right? Like that's
literally that's developing neuron pathways in your brain as you're playing, right?
Or damaging them or something. But I think that I think the Satanic Panic really is a foundational cornerstone of how Caves of QUD gets to be. This is an unattended side effect of the 80s Satanic Panic.
I love accidentally striking that vein. That's perfect. So what happens after your teenage years together? Like, were you guys actually tinkering on games? So you're playing them together, but were you rolling your own RPGs? Or, like I remember as a kid when I would play a game, there was some that would just grab me to the point that I would need to like go and make a map for my own game, or like, write up the story of some big RPG that were there inklings of that sort of starting in your teenage years, or did development sort of come a lot later somewhere?
No, we started early. We were making, I did the same thing. I mean, before I had a computer, I remember my mom and like a few years ago found these like old Double Dragon levels I had made.
Amazing.
Like, I made like sheets and sheets of Double Dragon levels. And like, yes, writing had a notebook where I would write Dragon Warrior. I was really into the first Dragon Warrior, I'd write Dragon Warrior stories. And then, like, for me, the computer came a little later, but I mean, again, it was like introduced. I mean, I started learning BASIC in school around maybe that time as well. And then when I got to Brian's house, Brian's already making, Brian has made several games at that point. And I'll let Brian talk about that. But from that point, even from that, I mean, we were making games from then, and then have remained lifelong friends since then. And at each stage, even before, I mean, we made all unfinished, basically, except for QUD and Sproggywood, arguably QUD. But tons and tons of games that are just like out there, or like not out there, like in somewhere on a hard drive that are half finished, or like on like a design document because it was a tabletop game or something.
Yeah, and for me, like when I was starting to play Pool of Radiance, I was immediately going, oh, I'm going to make games, right? And so since I was 8 or 9, I've been trying to develop games, right? Like I finally, 15 or 20 years later, got the QUD engine going good enough that I was like, oh, I don't have to throw this away after 6 months, and it was finally strong enough to, it's sort of lasted the test of time at this point. But like Jason says, we've been making games. I've been working on game engines, and we've been working on, developing game worlds and playing tabletop games. And I think in part we kind of developed separately, and then we started talking about role-playing game overlap. And then at some point we kind of merged the video game and the role-playing game work we were doing together. And that merger is what became QUD. We eventually went like, what are we doing? Like, I'm building these game engines, and we're working on this RPG on the side. It's a little more complicated than that, but we eventually said, like, what if we just go crazy and mash these things up together? Will it be fun? We don't really know.
Okay, and was that kind of, so actually talk me through when this kind of hobbyist game making became Freehold games, because I kind of want to put you guys, if I was bold enough to do so, I don't want to put you guys in quote unquote like the industry, the games industry, or anything weird or like gross like that. I want to kind of like take you and place you in some other like really unique spot alongside our mutual friends, and probably your closest parallels in the games industry, which is Bay 12, right? Like Tan and Zach, the creators of Dwarf Fortress, who, in my conversations with them, like, they didn't even know that this kind of games industry existed until like they were helping out some friends at PAX, right? And they were like, oh, okay, are these other people, I guess we're making games like them too, or whatever. When did Freehold kind of become a thing, and when did the hobbyist game thing kind of turn into like, oh, okay, we're actually doing this and we're going to make a go of it? And it's totally fine if the answer is 3 years ago or something like that,
Well, yeah, well, I had a small like non-games startup right? In 1998 or so.
Yeah.
And I worked that. We eventually sold it in 2007.
Yep.
And that's the year I started working on QUD. And we did not have commercial aspirations yet then.
Yeah.
But I was like, well, okay, I'm going to have to do something because now I'm just like a boring architect at Dell. And that's just like, I'm very unexcited about that. So let's do something else. I think we started getting kind of old. In right, like we were turning 30 and we were like, well, we've been working on these games completely as a hobby. Like Caves of QUD had been out there on like Something Awful in the Bay 12 forums for a few years. We're skipping a little bit of the hobbyist, but we're just making QUD for fun. We both have careers. Jason works at is working at like Salesforce doing technical writing, like is founding some of their like their biggest deal documentation at the time. But we were like 30 and we're like, well, if we're seriously going to make video games, we should try to make a video game, right? Seriously.
Yeah.
And so we said, well, why don't we enter a game contest? And if we think we can do it professionally, we ought to be able to win. I don't know why we thought we could do this. We had never done it professionally or anything, but we were just like full of absolute vim and hubris. And so we entered the Something Awful game competition like, oh, we're just going to win it. And we got we paired up with this amazing artist, Jana Heiska, and we won it. And we said, well, geez, if we could win it, I guess we have to try to make a video game now. We made this game about ballroom dancing with Jana Heiska. And we said, well, what are we going to do? What if we take this? We've been working on this roguelike for a few years, Caves of QUD. What if we make like a simpler, focused roguelike that you can play on PC and phones, and we'll make it with Yana's beautiful art. And that was like 2012 or something.
Yeah.
And we were like, we have no idea how well it's going to do, but let's take this award-winning, won the Something Awful Game Jam team and try to ship a game. And we made Sproggywood, which was a modest success, right? Like it wasn't a doorbuster, but it sold six figures on Steam and mobile.
Great.
And we said, in the lee of Sproggywood's modest success, hey, Steam, since right now you've got Greenlight, and that's the barrier to get on Steam. We've got this text-based game, QUD. Would you greenlight us doing this with tiles without us actually going through Team? Can we just get a Steam token for it based on Sproggywood's success? And Steam said, sure, go ahead and put QUD on Steam. And we said, great, we're going to put QUD on Steam with like the simplest tile set and make like $1,000, and that'll pay for maybe some more art or something, right?
Yeah.
And we launched it, and the first day just blew the socks off of Sproggywood sales-wise in 2015. Wow. And we were like, what is happening? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all, right? Like, this game doesn't have anything. It's still a text-based UI. It doesn't have sound. It doesn't have gamepad. It's like keyboard and mouse with tiles instead of ASCII for some of the stuff. But there was just, people wanted to play it. It was different enough even then that it appealed to enough people for us to say, look, this is interesting. What if we just invested some more in QUD and see what happens based on that investment?
What year would this have been?
That is 2015 when we first went
2015. So you're also in the like very early days of early access as well.
Yeah, right? That's right.
Yeah. Which was a very, like people have their thoughts about early access now, and when I say people, I mean your general Steam users or whatever, but generally it's just like accepted as a norm. But back then it was very rocky beginning with Steam early access. Like people didn't know what to think about. I remember when we pushed Mellow into early access, we made like a Kickstarter style, 2-camera video where we're like, we know how you feel about early access. We're going to do it right. And it was kind of like, I don't know who we were pitching to. It was like, we weren't asking for their money really. I guess we were always selling the game, but it was an interesting time to go in. So to go into early access with, again, this very, very unique game that, as you say, is like only the bones of it there and have the success. Brian, you kind of touched on that, like maybe it was, that people were just kind of into it, but is there something, and especially like thinking back to it now and knowing what you know about the community and what's got people engaged into the game, is there something in particular that you think appealed to people or was key to its success back then?
I still don't know what people like about it.
Why do you like our game? Yeah.
I think a lot of the spirit of the game was there even back. Well, I mean, definitely was there. And
Mm.
so it looks a good amount different. It's much smoother to play now. But like, if I think already coming into early access, we had gotten the attention of definitely the roguelike community. Like, we had launched our first roguelike beta, open beta on, again, like our own forums, but then the first two places we put it were the Something Awful forums where we were posting, and the Bay 12 forums, because we were playing a lot of Dwarf Fortress.
Yeah, I don't even think we put it there, but rather
Someone else did.
Getter 777 would have posted about it.
Read about it, and then we started posting about it. Yeah. But I mean, like, so it had this little following, and people were hooked into like, oh, this is a weird, unique thing. And then once we were on Steam, it was just all organic growth. Like, we've really until like maybe last week, we've never actually done any marketing. Yeah. It's really just been organic, and just like over time, people were exposed to it on Steam, and it kind of grew into a little community over those first few years. And then as it got like bigger and bigger, we got more and more serious about working on it. And it was only until at some point we were like, oh, let's actually plan on finishing it, plan on 1.0, have these milestones we're finally going to hit, decide that's what's going to be 1.0.
So let's go back to the pre-Steam development of Caves of Qud, because as you mentioned, got together with Yana, you've put Sproggywood out into the world. But if my math is correct, in 2015, when you launch Caves of Qud, you've already been working on the game for 7 to 8 years at that point.
Yeah.
So like.
Oh, go ahead. You
go for it, Jason.
Well, I was just going to say, like, if you were to draw the timeline, the big points are basically like 2007, end of 2007, 2008 is when we start. Mm-hmm. And that's a time where Brian's working on a roguelike engine, and we're developing a tabletop setting with actually a whole tabletop game and its own mechanics too, but particularly the highlight of which is like this very expansive world that we're writing history about. And we're kind of playing around with other designs, like we're making a web game, like that was all happening, like kind of like a what is it, like Gang Wars type game, right? Like like browser based, like turn-based game. So that's all happening in 2008, and then we released that after several years of working at it, only showing it to our friends in December 2010. That's the open beta, and then 2012 is when Sproggy we win the Something Awful monthly game thing. We start working with Yana. We start Sproggywood development. Sproggywood comes out in 2014 on PC, and then in 2015 Sproggywood comes out on mobile. And at the same time, we were able to put Qud on Steam. And then from there, we're in early access for 9 years up until 2024. And there's all sort of like sub milestones in that time frame that are like, oh, we launched this big patch, we start to get a like mature cadence in terms of how we do the development. That leads us up until December 2024 when we hit 1.0.
Yeah, and I mean, really, so much stuff happens in there, right? Like, we started as a 2-person team. At this point, we've got like a team of, I don't even know how to count them. Like, if you include the mayors, it's a couple dozen people really working inside of Freehold. Yeah. It's a big team that we accrued over time that all love the game and showed up saying, I could do this piece of this better than you, and I love this game so much. I really wish you would let me help you. Right. And so like all the people working on it just like really love the world and have something that they want to bring personally to it. And for a long time, we were both working full-time jobs outside of it. Only very recently have we been able to commit full time, and we still don't really know how that'll go in the future, right? It's such a weird game. Right, these days, no clue what the tail will look like. Not still trying to figure out what we're going to do with future support. We definitely want to support it, but what exactly that looks like depends a lot on how like the next 6 months go, right?
Of course. Yeah.
So it's a lot of fun, but it's been such a long road.
So you just mentioned the mayors. Let's shout them out. Tell everyone who the mayors are for our listeners who aren't familiar with the Qud community or development.
Mayors is what we call what our Discord mods call themselves. Based on the mayor is an important role in the world of Qud. Each village tends to have a mayor who functions as a mayor. So the mayors are our Discord mods who have created a like wonderful space to hang out in, and are very are we have an approach to moderation where we will ban you if your vibes are bad, basically,
Yeah,
right? Like if
same.
you're just making the place a shitty place to hang out in, which a lot of people on the internet playing games are doing or are trying to do. We're not,
Yeah.
but you're following the letter of the law, whatever. Like, our mayors are very proactive about creating a space where queer people feel welcome, where, people don't feel like they're being infected with a certain type of gamer culture that's very aggressive and, silencing marginalized voices.
Yeah.
So yeah, they've really helped us build this community space that that people enjoy being in.
It really is wonderful, and I loved it when the reason why I brought up to dive into is because when I got into the Discord and I was going around looking at it, and it was like meet the mayors, and it had their little intros and everything, and it was perfectly cut. It's like, of course, these are the exact kind of people that I want, like in the Discord helping me out as I'm finding my way through the world.
Okay, they're like uniformly amazing people doing
Yeah.
incredibly bizarre PhDs, etc. Like they're all lovely.
Yeah, I can imagine this game must attract people from just like QUD itself and the inhabitants of QUD, like the kinds of games, the kinds of people that must be attracted to this game and its world. They're not just one kind of monoculture, I'm sure. It's like a vast array of different people. It's such a special project.
I mean, even inside the team, we have like me and Jason, and there's like an Air Force aerospace guy and guy who's a PhD brain mathematician, and right, like it's just a bunch of weirdos, like fully committed to the syncretic weirdness of QUD.
Committed to the bit. I love it. All right, let's dive into a bit of QUD development. Like you've just given us the timeline, Jason. So let's talk about that open beta. Actually, I want to go just right back to the start. You were talking about when you first started and the two of you were kind of working on it on the side whilst you got your full-time jobs, obviously for a long part of it. But at the start, what was the first things that you started to lay down for a project like this? Like, obviously, you can look at QUD and you can pull out the different elements that we've spoken about a lot. Like, it's a roguelike, it's an RPG, it's literary thing, it's, there's turn-based combat, it's a turn-based game, like blah, blah, blah. But what was the kind of the first core of what you put down and, that was sort of the seed for everything else, or the core of the game at that point in time?
I think we both should answer this, but I think there's a few, even with that, there's a few threads there. One is that Brian is building his nth iteration of a roguelike engine, and he'd really get it into kind of in parallel to the development of Unity entity component systems, solving a lot of the problems, the design problems that you run into when you start to make a systemic systems-driven roguelike.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian's doing that. And at the same time, we're playing a lot of Ancient Domains of Mystery and Dwarf Fortress. So we're getting into the simulation stuff and also just like the systems interactions that a lot of the roguelike genre, the traditional roguelike genre kind of really, was built on. And so we're starting to say things like, and we're kind of like also crossing that with like our tabletop development. So we, one of the first things we said was like, we want a science fiction roguelike. We really want, like, a lot of roguelikes are based in Tolkien fantasy, which we like, but we kind of we really like to be like kind of go deeper in our settings and get a little offbeat. And Gamma World, as was said, a huge inspiration. We were like, what if we had a science fiction? What if we had something that was kind of like Gamma World, and in some cases very much like Gamma World, but through the lens of the systemic roguelike? Because like Brian alluded to earlier, when you make a character in Gamma World, there's all it uses so much procedural generation, that game in particular. I mean, a lot of tabletop does in an analog form, but Gamma World so much relies on random rolls of characters, and you have a lot less control. And this kind of mapped cleanly, we thought, are in interesting ways to roguelike design, which was coming up in parallel to Brian writing this deep roguelike engine. And so really that's where it started. I think like Gamma World, science fiction, roguelike, in this roguelike engine with this really interesting, very historically like informed world we were building for our tabletop game. We were making this tabletop game, hashing out this big setting. What if we took one corner of that world we're developing and focused a game there? This will be one of the 10 games we make, because this is how we're thinking at the time. We'll make the
It'll take
roguelike.
170 years. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Exactly. We'll make the roguelike in QUD. We'll make the web game in here. I mean, because that's what we were doing. The web game was set in another part of the world. And QUD is just where we, fell down the well and actually made it.
Okay, and that tracks for you, Brian. Is that the kind of core as you saw it at the start?
Yeah, I think that's true, right? Like we had two threads that collided basically sort of by happenstance, which was a technological one where I was kind of building an abstract engine without thinking too carefully about the kind of game I was making. And like Jason said, I had been building these iterative roguelike engines for years thinking, I could do this better. I'd been playing games like Omega, which were big open world games, eventually Atom, and saying, it would be cool to be able to like traverse a contiguous world. I bet you could do this in computers that are going to be out there 5 years from now. And at the same time, we had these incredible tabletop games in the 90s. Like our friend group stumbled into like no combat, purely narrative role-playing game very, very early. And we had some incredible dungeon masters that just built these like super awesome worlds that were very offbeat. And this world building came from that, and the collision of those two paths turned into QUD, basically that technical path and that design path.
Yeah, I think of it almost like just as an amendment to that. I'd say it's almost a third path too, because I do think like and then we can get into, I know some of what we might want to talk about is like maybe how some of these early design decisions are not great 10 years later when you have to reckon with them. But, we also did love these really tactical turn-based, generally combat-driven games, right? And so QUD at its core, built on top of this roguelike engine, is this turn-based tactical combat-driven game, a lot of which that's still where a lot of the magic kind of happens. Sometimes it's combat, sometimes it's other systems that are colliding to produce interesting effects. But like on a turn-by-turn level, you're walking around, you're fighting things, you're taking individual actions that are affecting the world, and that I think that thinking evolves out of a whole other design lineage. We play a lot of Magic the Gathering. That was always our big in Brian's house when we were playing. And so like the thinking of little design modules, little Legos that can be freely combined like cards can in a Magic deck, I think is deep in our both of our design philosophies, and that leads a lot to thinking of packaging mutations that way, right? And how to design for procedural games where you want a lot of like expressivity, give the player the sort of like creative palette to produce something in a procedural manner, and then meet the challenges in the world, which are also procedural, and get something really fun out of that.
I'm going to come back to both of those points because I really love them, like that idea of early design challenges that create this kind of dead ends for you, or problems, design debt, so to speak, that you're bringing with you throughout, almost 2 decades now. But then the idea of like modular design and the way in which we can create and design systems and content that they can plug together with like Lego blocks. Like it's really brilliant. But for the moment, I want to dive in for Brian. Now, Brian, I'm not a programmer, right? I'm a muggle, so to speak, in video games. But when you say a roguelike engine, for our more technically minded listeners, what you've spoken about contiguous worlds or whatever, but at that point in time, what were your general aspirations? Did it start by just playing around, or did you have some kind of grand design or goal or major problem that you saw in, and what you considered to be roguelike engines, quote unquote, at the time that you were trying to break?
So my work had really started in like the 90s on these engines. This is a time of like very traditional C++ engines, like object hierarchies and really, really static, monolithic worlds, and you're very limited in the kind of worlds you're building and how designers can contribute. And I'm looking at these things at the same time. A lot of people are looking at these games and saying like this type of architecture, this object architecture, just doesn't work when I try to take a shield and a sword and then make a sword shield, which is something you want to do in a world where you're trying to be expressive and combine things modularly. And
Which
so,
touches into these. You've got Jason over here as well, talking about, and yourself, no doubt, your philosophy included in regards to these modular design bits. If the engine's not interacting with that in the right way as well, right?
yeah, and so I tried to build these games and would just very quickly hit a brick wall in terms of complexity. We're adding another thing is like 10 times is more complicated, it just grows exponentially. Is it possible to build an engine where this complexity scales more linearly with the amount of garbage you have in the game? And I, alongside a bunch of other people, based on the same kind of papers by like Scott Billis coming out of Dungeon Siege, particularly the Fubi papers, they spelled out a new kind of architecture, which is actually not what modern ECS is talking about, which is a memory optimization, but is rather a kind of game architecture that's based on composition instead of hierarchy, where you're able to say this object is composed of a bunch of different behaviors, these components that composite together. So maybe it can store liquid and it's armor and it has a brain, it can talk and it can fly, right? All those things are composed together. So rather than being like a sphere that is flattened, that is a shield, and a rod that is a sword, and then you can't really butt those together, instead you're able to just kind of collect a bunch of components into a particular entity and add or remove components as you please. Engines like Unity came out of that sort of architectural milieu. And the engine I built in Caves of QUD was built at like the exact same time as Unity, and using that. And it ends up being like Unity very successful, right? Like you build very powerful games in Unity quite easily. Same thing with QUD. It ends up being a very successful architecture, this compositional pattern versus an old school object hierarchy pattern. And that's basically the technical core of QUD, with some aspirations like, I feel like I want to be able to explore this world in a more meaningful, contiguous way. I want a world I can really inhabit that feels less game-like. That's a world like I'm playing Daggerfall at the time and going, oh, this is so awesome. I can go anywhere in these horrible dungeons across millions of miles of empty space, right? But you can imagine doing it better than that, right? Like when you're 15 and full of them or whatever. And so like, what if you could have this huge contiguous world that you could just wander and be in, right? Like where there's birds flying around and I can go do whatever, right? Lots of people are feeling that at that time. All these open world games come out of that, but that's the milieu in which computers are becoming powerful enough to represent these worlds, where Dwarf Fortress becomes a thing, where QUD becomes a thing, where Minecraft is built, right? Where computers suddenly have enough memory to hold whole worlds. A bunch of these projects flower up where you've got a whole world, and QUD's just one of them.
Yeah, it's kind of like the tech tree enabled then these things to come into reality, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
Now, you spoke earlier before about, iterating on a bunch of engines, and then you're making QUD and it's the one that kind of lasted longer than 6 months or whatever. Let's talk about the technical challenges of sort of, achieving that dream. Was there something that you felt that you broke the back of, or was it this kind of thing that, as you're saying, the actual hardware is developing alongside your and others' aspirations? Do you remember any particular technical challenges that you overcame, or something that helped you get there?
I mean, the whole thing has been a series of first external challenges, extrinsic technical challenges, and then intrinsic technical challenges created by myself in the past, right? So prior to that, I think the ECS technology was the real game changer, and it changed all kinds of engines for the better of this composition technology. I think like QUD didn't run that well in 2007, right? It strains computers of today. But I was not thinking about building a practical program, right? I was thinking about like, what if I push the computer right to the edge, right? This computer that has some number of megabytes of memory, right? Computers have kind of grown into it. Nowadays, we're talking about putting it on a phone. I mean, phones didn't exist when we started Caves of QUD, right? Like that's incredibly wild.
Yeah.
And so like, if you were to ask what kind of challenges, like it's just for a game that lasts from 2007 until now, it's endless, right? Like it's a new challenge. Instead of making a new game to take advantage, we're saying, how can we make QUD relevant in this world? Oh, look, computers are now powerful enough to run it. That's great. Oh, like this phone in my pocket's now powerful enough to run it. Can we do that?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's it's a slightly different set of challenges. And now we're like, well, we build this game in the console. How are we going to give that a new UI? How are we going to have to make that work on gamepad? How are, there's just, it's nuts. And it's a big challenge for a very, very small team. It's just a couple of technicians, really.
You mentioned a bunch of people, like, and obviously huge corporations now as well, like Unity, but obviously Yucam and that in the early days that were working on this stuff. Did you have any contact with with folks who were trying to do the same thing as you, or were you kind of working in your own silos, or at least yourself, kind of breaking the back of this and just sort of reading papers and sort of what was available on the internet at that time?
No, I mean, I feel like I felt like an industry outsider until just a couple of years ago. I was not connected really to anyone until maybe really 5 or 6 years ago, when we started to get to know people.
And because I know there's like TIG source around there, like communities out there that where there was more contact, but I don't. Yeah, I think Something Awful was the one we were the most in contact with. But yeah, for a long time it did. I've reflecting some like a lot of what Turn Adams has said. Like it did really feel like we were in our own bubble, and that probably produces some of the originality, but also some of the weird, it's good to have people to talk to who are encountering similar problems. So yeah, it produces the weird signature of our particular path, I think.
It's really hard not to talk about Dwarf Fortress and Caves of QUD in the same breath, right? Obviously, in regards to your development length, the style of game, the visual treatment, the dual developers kind of like segmented from the rest of the industry, working on this weird little hobbyist project that then became, commercial success for all of you.
Let me amend that answer. Thinking about it for a minute, it's hard. I'm like unearthing very old memories here. But the truth is that the roguelike development community, I feel like I've been an industry liar, but the roguelike development community was very active even back in the 90s on Usenet, roguelike development, Darren Hebden's roguelike news. I wrote some early development articles, and so did other people, about building dungeons, running combat AI in the early 90s. And I feel like the roguelike community in particular is really important to at least like the technical development of this game. Certainly the design development, but I can speak to the technical development. And those early articles, that community was something I was a part of. I wouldn't consider it mainstream game development, right? Like I feel like roguelike development has always been an offshoot branch, right? Like until it became every video game, right? Like, but early on it was a very radical branch of game development that had deep roots, like one of the oldest branches, but disparate, like way out there, but certainly active. And I benefited a lot from those discussions and communities.
Yeah, it's funny. Roguelike design systems and approach to like video game design methodology kind of feels like the salt and pepper equivalent of like the games industry. It's like these imperial colonizers coming along, finding this incredible spice, and now it's in every dish on every side of the planet.
It is a little bit like that.
So, but that is beautiful. So even though you guys didn't feel you were a part of this industry that was happening, or even like too aware of it, there was definitely this development community where you're breaking the back of these problems, whether they be design or technical, and you're a part of it, like you're saying, you're developing articles and everything for it too.
I'm curious for Brian, because I know that there was, like you said, I know the article you're talking about on Usenet, et cetera. I feel like, do you feel like that carried through?
No,
like I feel like it was
like Andrew Dahl, and like there was a split there where I was just kind of in my own silo. I was a part of it like when it was like Darren Hebden's roguelike news, and then we like kind of went off on our own silo, and then in around 2010 or something, we came back together with the roguelike. So there was a lacuna there where it's really when I did my non-game startup, right? I was outside of games really and just kind of building stuff. And so only in 2007 did we really kind of come back, despite the fact that I had been tinkering on the side.
But I do think, I think for most of that time, up until maybe, we put QUD out, we're not as much like it's we did things really the hard way. And like, I didn't think as much to go look for other people developing the same type of things or similar types of things that we are. And instead you just smash your head against the problem over and over. And then it's really wonderful to ultimately find people who are doing a lot of the same things. And like that is to say, like, we were playing Atoms and we were playing Dwarf Fortress a lot at the time of in 2008, 2007. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going in really and reading about, like Thomas Biskup's like thought process about what went into the development of Atom. And so that engagement in like developer community comes a little later for us, or at least in that time we were kind of alone, and then maybe on either side of it there was more connection.
I never felt like a peer to Thomas Biskup, right? Like I felt like Thomas Biskup is off there making Atom. Like that's amazing. I feel like right. Tarn and Zach are making Dwarf Fortress. That's amazing. We're just working on this goofy little. I still feel like that to some extent, yes. But like we at least shipped a game, right?
And just to say about what you just said, like sometimes I feel like I've gotten a couple times people like, I'm sorry to keep comparing you to Dwarf Fortress. No one ever has to apologize for that. Like we're such giant fans of Tarn and Zach, both as people, but also like, I mean, it's one of the most important games of all time, in our opinion. It's beautiful. It's just, it's a, and so like to be put in the same conversation with them is incredibly flattering. Yeah. And they were extremely direct inspiration. Like we're making Caves of QUD very much like in the environment of playing Dwarf Fortress, the art style, the original. I mean, it's funny you said it's not ASCII. It is ASCII underneath. You could turn the tile art off and then just play in the original ASCII. But if you look at that original ASCII aesthetic, like it's very much inspired by the beautiful ASCII art that Tarn and Zach were doing for their worlds. And I mean the deep simulation stuff is drawn a lot from them. So I mean they're looming large in this picture.
I know that in recent years, you guys, obviously, for all the reasons that we're talking about, have been put in the same room a few times. Like there's a fantastic roundtable between the four of you, from PC Gamer. There's, obviously you're now published under the same publisher, right, with Tanya over at Kid Fox and the incredible work that she does, especially for developers like yourselves who find yourself in these weird little procedural storytelling niches, right? But was there a point in time where, you said you haunted the forums a little bit, you posted your game there, but was there any kind of contact between you and Tarn and Zach in regards to development or discussing what you're doing or, as peers at any point in time that was initiated?
I mean, I remember when we met them. We met them at the original roguelike celebration, which now, I mean, if people aren't familiar, roguelike celebration is a yearly around October kind of like in recent years online celebration of roguelikes, and it's this beautiful conference festival that is really inclusive and like will go weird places, right? They had a planetary scientist talk about slime molds, and they'll have like the speakers that come and talk. It's not like a game. It's like it's willing to be a lot more than just a pure game design or game development conference. But at the first one of those, which was, it was the idea of a friend of ours, Noah Schwartz, who like kind of started Roguelike Celebration with some other people. The first one in 2016. Tarn and Adams were invited to speak. Brian and I were invited to speak. And so we were all in San Francisco together. And a mutual friend, another roguelike developer, Jim Shepard, who kind of knew both of us, knew us and also knew Tarn and Zach, said, hey, Zach actually plays a good amount of your game. He's a big fan of it. And maybe we knew that already, but like that was the first time where they were like, let's talk. Here's Tarn and Zach. Like, nice to meet you. And they were aware of our game being posted on their forums. And from then we've been really lucky to become friends with them. Like they're wonderful people, the best people, truly, like so kind and generous with their time. And like you said, we've done some panels and stuff with them. I know some people think probably like, oh, that's how we got hooked up with Kid Fox. We were actually friends with Tanya even before that. So that's another connection. One of our real early, I'd say, industry connections. And so, but that's kind of where we're at with them, and we love the success they've had and will continue to have.
Yeah, nothing but admiration for those two. And the word that you mentioned with generous is just so true. Like I remember I met Tarn in 2016. We're both keynoting a conference in Busan, like Busan Indie Connect, and he was just like the sweetest, most generous dude with his time, and like the chats that we had and dinners together and everything was just so lovely. And every time I see him, or or Zach as well, always have a moment of time for you. It's just incredible. I do want to get back to this concept though of this like modular design though. So we've got Brian over looking at the technical implementation of this, but Jason, talk to me as well about your aspirations for this from, because as Brian's hinted at, this is something that, roguelikes have been doing for a while. And it's kind of like the tech was lagging behind in regards to the ability to put these things together, right? The concepts existed there. We mortal minds were like, trying to put these ideas together into these machines. But what were your sort of aspirations there, Jason, in regards to, the two of you bringing together this kind of truly modular design that we can see in Caves of QUD that has given way or given birth to these incredibly emergent sort of situations and, gameplay opportunities that players find themselves in?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is that, like, at the time, it's very raw, right? So we don't really understand this stuff in these terms, and I think a lot of the QUD design philosophy has developed as a process of us looking back at our really early nascent intuitive work and unpacking what was good about it and also unpacking what was bad about it to understand like that aspect of it. But yeah, at the time, I think, what I think really drives it underneath all that, which was present at the time, is this real affinity for emergent narrative, for emergence and emergent narrative. For, I always loved, even very early, to play you play games like, I don't know, SimCity or SimAnt, or games that are like systems driven that are not necessarily narrative in the way that we sometimes think of it traditionally, but are really good at producing situations that you as like the internal storyteller can digest and then make sense of, and then you're telling your own version of what's happening there, right? And in that sense are deeply narrative. And this is how we this is not like we invented this. This is an way to understand how narrative works in games. And sometimes what it's specifically what we're calling emergent narrative, right? And so that type of like affinity starts us down a path of like, okay, now how do you get that, right? Like that's kind of, it's kind of a slippery idea if you don't have the design language to get at it. But one thing that starts to come up if you think about it is to produce that narrative, one of the important things actually is to not have the narrative pre-given to you. And so what is given to you? Well, some sort of parts of the narrative must be given to you for you to assemble something into what ultimately in your mind is the emerging narrative, right? Those parts that are necessarily sort of pre-narrative, but probably narrative inflected in some way so that they become, it's a little generated person. It's a little generated village. It's things that will be worked into a story. They need to have some sort of structure, right? They need to be combined in certain ways to produce the bigger product. And those start to look a lot like modules once you shake that out. And then once you start to kind of try to put them together, you come up with some principles around that, right? Like why do we have Lego bricks instead of Lego weird stars? Well, it's because the brick is really versatile. It's used in a lot of different designs. It can be stacked this way, but also this way and form a foundation. And so there's a lot of utility in having modules that can be combined in many different situations and maybe have a sort of strong personality in terms of what they're able to give to a larger structure, but also it's not prescribed, right? It's not like I get a brick and it has to be used as a car door, right? If it was just a car door, then it's only really going to be a car door. Now, if it's a brick that I can kind of imagine is a car door or like a part of a car, then it can also be these 8 other things, right? And so like from first principles, really starting to understand what modularity is and how it can be used to produce ultimately like these emergent narrative things that grow out of it.
Mm-hmm. It is incredibly interesting hearing you say that, because one of the most beautiful things about QUD, and that really struck me getting into the game, and it's also just some background on me, narrative design and writing was how I got into games. So like immediately thinking about the narrative delivery systems and how this emergent narrative you're saying is teed up. But it's how it sits within this framework that you've developed of actual bespoke content, right? Like so there's a beautiful balance. And just for our listeners here, QUD is this incredible world. You've heard a lot about world building and everything, but you've also heard a lot on this podcast about, procedural generation or emergent storytelling and things. QUD has a mythology and a world map that is set in some ways and then generated in other ways, right? So like you say, a little village is generated, but this particular village on the map is there all the time and is named the same thing, right? And the world map, when you look at it, is generally all the same, but then when you go into the tiles, they're all generated and there are different things that can pop up. And even in regards to the people or the items and stuff, how did you, and I know it's an organic process, right, over 17 years, but like, what were the key elements for you helping to find that balance that has become so specifically QUD in regards to your execution between the bespoke content and the procedurally generated stuff?
Yeah, we could both maybe answer that too, because I think we have.
Yeah, Brian's really smart. Maybe we go to Brian first.
I'm wondering how Jason's going to. This is such a hard answer, right? Or such a hard question. So I'm interested to know what Jason thinks about it.
I do always fall back to say that, they give the easy answer, which is that it was so organic we didn't know what we were doing. But I think what happened was we had these two strong impulses, which is that we really wanted to make an RPG because we loved RPGs and we wanted to make a world. We were doing a bunch of world building for a tabletop setting. We've always done a lot of world building. Brian, that's a love we share. Sometimes we come at things at different angles, but sometimes we come at things at quite similar angles. And just like weird world building is something we've always done in whatever games we're making. And kind of a separate impulse, but there are nice ways in which they dovetail, but not always, is that we wanted to make this cool procedural systemic game that has these interesting simulative elements, and that where that also feel kind of like I have a tool set and I'm approaching the world in this way. And so we kind of start building those at the same time. And so I'm starting to write some of Jopa and here's what the world, I will have this cool idea for what this, we, for a long time, the spindle was something that appeared in several of our games going back in some form. And so we're writing these handwritten locations and touchstones in the world. And then we're designing this procedural systems driven game around them. And where do those meet? At some point, those things come into contact and are sometimes they fight, but other times after doing it for so long, we start to say one thing that's interesting about procedural content is it always needs to be read against something stable for it to get its meaning, for the meaning to cohere, right? And that stability can come from a lot of places. So a touchstone I like to use is that for Dwarf Fortress, they're really working in this Tolkien fantasy space. And so that allows people to kind of read the generated dwarves against their expectations and concepts of what a dwarf is and what a fantasy world is, what a fortress is.
Bring a huge amount of their own frame of reference in that world and mythology already. Yeah,
it's incredibly important that they're not, dweebles, right? If they are dweebles, if you go the path of doing something really unique and that doesn't have a clear frame of reference, you quickly run into this instance in the procedural world where, well, how is my player supposed to read that this variation on a dweeble is interesting when we don't know what a dweeble is, right? We know what a dwarf is. We know what an elf is because of, and that's a loaded term itself. You can get all the cultural baggage into what those things are, what those symbols mean, where they come from, etc. But they are there, right? Yeah. And so you really need to have something now that you need to have something stable for the procedural stuff to be read against. That doesn't mean it needs to be handwritten towns and characters. That is how it started for us. But you need to have these units of meaning, however you can get them, that are strong, that have strong personalities, strong resonances. We talk a lot about how our animal faction, this is kind of an overlooked aspect of QUD, I think. Obviously a big part of QUD is weird interactions with animal species, right? But those animal species and the fact that they are mostly frogs, bears, fungi, baboons, things that classes of objects of creatures that exist in the world that we have kind of a mental map of, and that have resonances in whatever way they do, that allow us, when we see the text questioning, like hated by baboons for questioning the origins of the moon, we're already primed to be thinking like, oh, how can I make sense of this with what I know about baboons? Much different than hated by dweebles for questioning of the origins of the moon, which we do have some, right? We have some dweebles, but the thing is, it's very important to us that we have, like for the effect of QUD, that we have these animals that almost function as these like ancestral, like I think of them these days as tarot suits, right? There's something very, very kind of like core to our collective understanding that people can kind of like, that when we spin off and do the weird things with them, you have some sort of grounding to interpret those through.
I love it. It's similar to what we were talking about with even just the abstraction and projection of like your world and the visuals, right? It's like having these touchstones to hold on to that enable you to then wander off into the weird, right? That you guys have created as well. When you talk about it isn't something that I'd actually explicitly thought about, but as you're saying it, I'm thinking about my time with QUD, and I'm thinking about, Gritgate and the bear, little population there, or I'm thinking about the baboons, and it really is kind of like 1 in every 4 characters that I sort of interact with, like new species or something, is kind of a completely left curveball. But because of that balance, like it enables me to let go. It enables me to sort of let the procedural generation wash over me. And that, especially when it comes to the procedurally generated text, when it is like a little bit more nonsensical, or there is something that's like a little bit strange and weird, it often will have, like you say, that touchstone of something that anchors it, right? We're talking about a baboon or something.
I think also, like, on a separate tack, when you play a game like Morrowind or Daggerfall or Dragon Age or any of these games that are like, especially the games like Morrowind and Dragon Age, which are fully authored and big, or Skyrim, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you get a sense that there's a cleavature between these like axial story points that couldn't be another way without telling a different story. And the side content, which is like the dungeon for the 6th Dragon Claw, which could easily be on a different mountain, or a Daedric Shrine, which could easily be on under a different cave, right? Without changing the frame narrative at all, right? And so, like, I don't think there's a good nomenclature we have in design to talk about those things, right? Or at least I don't know it, but I'm not a very good designer. But like, I feel the cleavature there between those framing, immutable sort of like eigenvectors of the narrative, and the things that people put in the game to play it and become little mysteries, but could easily be the other way. And if I could play Skyrim again with the dungeons in different places and the important characters in different places, I would get more out of it, right? Like, it wouldn't detract from that framing narrative, but would give me a new game to play in the small spaces, right? In the combat, there's orcs in this encounter, and now there's dragons, right? Like, my tactical choices are different. So, like, I think we sense intuitively that there's a difference between those two. Then one of the things we're exploring in QUD is, can we make that real? Like, there's this framing narrative, and then there's this other stuff. So when you boot up a new game, it's a new framing narrative, right? But that's reflected against this sort of like eigen narrative that exists from game to game.
And I think this balance that you've achieved has definitely, for both of the reasons that you're talking about, has created, again, this kind of soft landing fall, or this allowance, or this margin of error for folks who typically would bounce off procedural content. Like, as I've been navigating the game myself and doing research for this conversation, I have seen like a number of people just wander into the Steam discussion forums or the Discord or Reddit or whatever it might be and be like, hey, this stuff's like procedurally generated, how much of it is like this, or blah, blah, blah. And people will be like, oh no, there is like, just, you can do the main quest line and these things are author, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. And then they can go off and they can focus on those things. Whereas then you can have the other players. Like, at some point I was like, God, I'm going to be talking to Jason and Brian soon. I should probably get back onto the main quest line and do a little bit more, because I was just like running dungeons and digging through the earth and finding particular things that are completely procedurally generated, like totally outside of the frame narrative, as you're saying. But it does create this kind of beautiful allowance, or, like I said, margin of error for folks that would usually bounce off a niche like this.
Yeah, it's funny because you sometimes you see the same exact question like, oh, how much procedural generation is in this game? But it's like, it's unclear if it's negative or positive in the parentheses.
You don't know via text like what the response to your answer is going to be afterwards. Yes. You're like, where are they coming from on this one?
Exactly. And I'm always, you want to tell the people who think like, this is just all procedural gibberish. Like, actually, no, it's not. And like, and you want to tell the people who are like, what, there's the same static world map every time. This is not a real roguelike. Be like, no, actually come back. Like, so there's ways in which those are both, it's true. It's like, it's hard to, it's not, you can't put one tag on it. It's like
the other thing is that people's paths through the game are very different. Until the tutorial, the first book you encountered could equally be more likely be like a Markov chain versus like a beautifully handwritten piece of poetry, right? Like, and the first thing the player encountered was completely random, right? Like basically, and so people would have the first encounter of basically two different games, right? And so like that matrix is very difficult.
And this is actually where this I love when we have moments where these two design impulses of make the RPG world and make the systems driven game, they do fight a lot. But when there is something that really hits that they both make each other better, it's so beautiful. And this is one in which I think it is. It's in that I love the fact that there are people out there who are not doing the main quest and are treating QUD like a weird system, like, not just purely a system sandbox, like an open world. Like obviously in an open world, the whole idea is you can ignore the main quest. But in most open world games, the main quest looms so large, and there's always this like fat idea that like, I'm going to get back and do that, obviously. And in QUD, you have many people who are like, there's a main quest, or like, there's a main quest. Like, there's that
it's
question.
It's not signposted at all, right, in the game too. Like, you have to kind of be told by people that there is a main quest or pick up on it part of the way through the game.
Well, it's funny because just like if you lay it out geometrically, we have the starting village, the character right in the center of it. There's two quests. The character, there's three actually, but there's two like quests that are centered around the starting village. The one right in the center that you get from the first NPC you talk to is not the main quest. The main quest starts at the guy in the corner tucked away in the hut. And that is kind of emblematic. That's kind of emblematic of the like something going on. And I actually think the main quest is that much stronger and that much there's this real specific aesthetic texture that comes from it not feeling like it is dead center in the map, but actually off to the side, and you have to it has to come at you from a bit of a slant. I think that just generates this whole other feeling when you're going through it. And when you get deep in it and you're like, oh, this is really like a main quest. Like there are some notes we hit there that we're really proud of that are like, it is a real RPG main quest type thing. But like the fact that it can be missed, and like if there's like a perfect percentage of players I want to do the main quest, and for most games that's 100% that have a main quest, and for us I feel like it's not 100%, and like obviously that you run into your own trouble there, because if someone's asking is there a main quest in this game, if they're the type of person who would love the main quest, well, there's a little sadness there, sure, but there's such an impulse in games and in any type of work that's being developed inside of capitalism, to get really broad about it, to make everything available to everyone and to like polish your product so perfectly so that everyone can touch the like, the surface of it that they're meant to. And there's something really beautiful about like, well, this is a thing and not everyone's going to see that, even though it's really special and we put a lot of love into that, and that's okay. Like that can be how it is. And that's
we had a conversation with Ben Esposito, indie developer out of LA, talking about his game Neon White and obviously his career leading up to that. And he touched on something really interesting that he's drawn to in games, and especially that it inspired this kind of the 2000s aesthetic and design inspirations for Neon White, which is this idea of design confidence. Whereas contemporary games are constantly like this, there's this anxiety from the developer that like, do we have your attention? But what if we put these flags on top of these buildings and there's 100 of them, and and then we put a mini map up and everything. It's and the quest line, this is the main quest line. This is where all the meaty story is. This is where the best items are. And it has this design anxiety. And I would say that QUD, what you're talking about, has this design confidence where it's like, excuse the curt way of saying it, but like, You want the main quest line? Fuck you. It's in the bottom left-hand corner and you might miss it, right? It's like that's like the CUD kind of just this game is here and it's going to reward you for just tumbling down into its depths.
Yeah, it's more like design hubris or something, right? Like, I don't
design arrogance. Yeah,
I feel like it's not a purely negative opinion, but at the same time, it's a rare thing. I think it used to be more common in games, and has become less common as budgets have increased and risk has increased, and all of those things make it more and more impractical to have some percentage of your players find the game that you're trying to make, right? And that's like a completely reasonable thing to do if you're trying to make a living. And we're under the same pressures, right? Having grown it into a commercial game, but it's a great experience, right? And it's a particularly, like, I'll say this is kind of an adjunct, but I think it's relevant, which is like, why do you make an RPG like CUD versus a Morrowind? And one of the things I really enjoyed in like the 90s is not knowing everything. You don't know what magic cards are out there. It's a mystery, right? Like, there's no internet to search it up. You're like, you get some like rumors about a magic card that exists. What cards are in all the set? You don't know. Like, Tom at the card had like some notes he scrawled at the magic tournament locally, right? Like, the world's a much fuzzier place. And one of the affordances you get from having part of your world be procedural is you can't wiki everything, right? Like, you can figure out what a thing is, but for your world, you don't know what's in that dungeon, right? Like, nobody else has ever explored that, right? Like, that's your world. And that's the feeling you had playing a game in 1995 that you don't get anymore, right? Like, some streamer already streamed the whole thing in 20 solid hours day one. And so you're kind of like also experiencing this thing behind glass, this Disney World that 1 million people go through a day. Yeah. And the procedural volume of CUD means like you get your own world, right? And I think that's a really important piece to all of this that not quite sure how to articulate the connection, but I think is intuitively in the mix.
I'm totally picking up on what you're putting down here, and I completely agree. And I'm going to lean on my anecdote of my experience with CUD to bring up a particular example of where, and this is going to inflate your design hubris, so I apologize, Brian, but where you two have made a specific decision that leans exactly into what you're talking about that I encountered in my game. So when I start CUD, I start a character and I get very attached to it and I die. Very standard CUD experience. And I'm like, oh, my jaw was just open, like mouth to the, like, so jaw to the floor for like staring at it in 30 seconds. I was sniped out of the dark, never saw my assailant, and that was it, save file gone. But then I was like, okay, I'm just going to throw characters against the wall and just see what happens. So then the next few days, I just cycle through characters, they die, and CUD's relentless to me. I'm doing some dailies and stuff on the side. Then I find my groove. I've got this character playing an Esper, so I'm killing things with my mental laser powers and everything, just having so much fun. And every character as well, I'm doing differently. I'm picking different presets already, really trying to get a flavor of it. And I get to this point where this character that I love, now about level 25, is the furthest I've ever made it in the game. Played dozens of hours now to get to this point. I contract a disease. And I don't even see it happening. And so I don't get the warning signs. It's just like, you have it. And it is the absolute worst disease for my incredibly squishy character because it drops my movement. You know which one I'm talking about, right? But this disease, I go to wiki it because by now I'm like, look, I'm trying to learn the game. I'm going to be a little bit, gentle on myself, and I'm wikiing things to make sure that I'm not just dying from stupid stuff. And this particular disease, to cure it, you need to find a book. Like, the wiki doesn't give me the cure. You need to find a book, and that book will tell you in your specific run of that game, one of the ingredients is procedurally generated, so it is different. So on the forums, on Reddit, on the wiki, everyone is like, you need to go to this book, and the book is in a specific place. But I hadn't been there yet. I didn't even know what this place was. I had to find it, like look it up on a map or whatever. And then I go there, and like I'm saying, it was specific to my game out of, a dozen particular possibilities or something. But that is exactly what you're talking about, Brian. It's this beautiful balance of like, oh, we could have told you this. This could have been on the wiki, but we're actually just going to change one thing, one element of this entire puzzle to make it so that it's different specifically for you on every run. It was like chef's kiss. I loved it.
Yeah, that's a nice part of we kind of hooked into this idea when we, at some point, when we were making this procedural world. And the affordance you get there is that people can't just looking things up with an asterisk, because we have a whole spiel about how we kind of like that in its own way. But and we love our wiki and the people who maintain it. But you have all these interesting things, little secrets about your game world that if it were a static RPG, you could just go figure out, and then they're just there. And because we proceduralize them, you have to kind of discover them each time. And then what we realize at some point is that, those, we call those secrets. And we actually now, for the most part, with several categories of them, like flag them as secrets in the game. And that's kind of where we have this whole like secret economy that is kind of bartered through the water ritual, which is this in-game diegetic like ceremony of sharing precious fresh water with another creature. And then you can kind of trade reputation with their faction to discover a secret. And that secret might be the location of an interesting dungeon in the world, which is, again, procedural every time. The location of the ruin of House Eisner, which is this artifact revolver that changes every time, and you need to like talk to people and share water with them, and give your precious water to trolls to figure out where this thing is. And it becomes like an actual interesting, like there's play there to the kind of like hidden information, and you can do fun things with it.
I also love the beauty of, there's something very specific about the water ritual. There's a few things that I love about it. It's genius, right? And I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about it. But one thing that I love that cracks me up is how if you gossip to them, you lose reputation. But if you ask them to gossip, if you ask them for gossip, like you lose reputation. But if you gossip to them and they get a cool secret, you gain reputation. It's like such a parallel to real life and social interactions. It's like everyone loves a juicy bit of gossip, but no one wants people poking into their business about random shit. Very good. Let's talk about the water ritual just quickly, because when I talk to people about Caves of Qud and why I love it and why the world has had such an impact on me, and for a video game as well, that again, I don't mean this in a like derogatory or like way or anything, but when you show people the game and they haven't had an experience like you guys have had with roguelikes or with Dwarf Fortress or whatever, and then you talk to them about the world, there can be a disconnect that happens in their brain. That's like, whoa, you're getting all of that from that, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I talk to them about is the water ritual. And there is something brilliant about the water ritual, which is this role-playing that we do in games that I think so many of these big RPGs and these big games, or that are trying to create these brand new worlds that involve people in, forget, which is this notion of ritual and ceremony that is a part of every culture, right? And you guys have created that with the water ritual, where, as you say, it's a way to find dungeons and get different artifacts and build your reputation or manage it with different factions. But it also invites the player to actually actively participate in the ritual of this world, and it's a way of kind of just leaning into it that just gives it this incredible grounding, I guess I would say. It makes it feel so much more real, as opposed to just reading about the world. Like in the Third Age, there was this dragon and he came and created Earth, or whatever, right? Blah, blah, blah. You're actually participating in its rituals. How did the water ritual come about? How far back did it happen in Qud? Was it in your role-playing game and you brought it over? Or how did it actually come about, this idea of the water ritual that's become so central to the game?
It did come, it was actually not in the earliest iterations. It came about midway, and it came about as part of this. It was right around when we added it was like 2015 when we went on early access in Steam. One of the big improvements to the game that we made for that launch was the faction, the reputation system. So there was always this kind of idea of factions in the game and different creatures belonging to factions, but we make that all exposed now. You have your reputation screen, which is really fun to scroll down and see all the different factions in the world and how much they hate you.
Hated by birds, or whatever.
Hated by birds. You're hated by a lot of things at the start. And then that idea of like, well, how are you going to actually, we had this idea, well, it's going to be great because birds will attack you, but if you ever get positive reputation with birds somehow, then they'll love you and come to your aid. And that always seemed really fun to us. And then when we were thinking of ways where you could actually like change your reputation, the idea of focusing it through these legendary creatures who are kind of like the faction guardians of their faction, who can give or take reputation with their faction. One way to do that might be killing them, but also then engaging in like treating with them, talking to them, and then maybe from there the manipulation of your reputation, or the using the reputation as a way to kind of like purchase or sell secrets about the world, came up as focused through this in-world representation of it that was the water ritual, which is inspired by Dune. There is a water ritual in Dune where, because Dune also is a world in which water, Arrakis is a world in which water is precious, fresh water is precious. Also, like the Japanese tea ceremony, I think was a touchstone to us, like the idea of this kind of like sacredness to this exchange, and water being, one of the first thing. If you want to hook someone in the world of QUD, one thing I've seen said that seems pretty, effective is the idea that water is both something you have to drink in the world and also the currency of the world.
Yeah.
People tend to get a kick out of that. And it is, that went into producing what is the sacred about the water ritual. Mm-hmm. But to speak on, one more thing, to hit on a note that you mentioned, is that a ritual is, what is a ritual? It is a loop, right? Where do we also talk about loops, right? There is something very much about, especially in roguelikes, where you're dying a lot and you're coming back. That is a ritual, right? That is a ritualistic practice. And so to turn that loop into a sort of diegetic ritual where you're actually doing something that has a cultural sustainedness in the world, that there's a natural like coming together of something there to kind of acknowledge that, oh, you're here again, you're playing the game again, you're coming, you're talking to Mehmet, you're doing it in this way that is both ritualistic in a sort of metaphysical sense with you controlling this character, but also ritualistic in the game world.
And then even the weight of initiating the war, because you could just use it as a way to plunge secrets from the game or plunder secrets from the game, but then you create this consequence as well for if you initiate the water ritual with someone and then you end up having to kill them or something terrible happens to them, it comes back on you in a very, very harsh way within the game systems, which is, really lends a weight to the decision that you're making. Now, it's a perfect segue into another thing that is brilliant about QUD that's really come up amongst the community and the players and is something that is shared online as a way to get people into the game, other player-generated stories that come from this game. So, Brian, do you have a particular memory of, favorite stories that players have shared of their runs or encounters that have happened in the game? Like anything particularly outlandish that you never could have expected?
I mean, the things that stick in my mind are mostly because I'm partly responsible for fixing them, are like the ridiculously buggy outcomes, which is like, boy, the one that sticks in my mind is we for a few weeks started having these reports of people just dying at random. They're like, I was just exploring the dungeon. I was auto exploring and I died instantly. It had no cause in the text. You died. And we were like, it has to be a mod. It has to be a whatever. But one day, I don't remember who found it, but somebody saw it happen in dev, right? So you're like, I believe you, but whatever. But somebody saw it. They're like, I was auto-exploring and I died. So like, let's figure out what's happening here. And we eventually popped the box. And we realized that what was happening was with this player was auto-exploring. So you can hit the auto-explore button and quickly explore the dungeon. They were stepping onto a pile of artifacts and then instantly dying. And we were like, what the heck is going on here? Like, what could that mean? Like, it's just like a random pile of junk, right? What was happening was that player was a mechanical player. So some percentage of things can spawn as mechanical, okay? That player also had the tinkering skill and could disassemble stuff and had the option to disassemble scrap turned on automatically.
Like automatically,
Yeah, so that when you stepped on scrap, you would automatically disassemble scrap. So what was happening was the players were auto-exploring, entering this auto-act mode, stepping onto a pile of loot, which triggered the system to have it disassemble all of the things in that cell that were scrap, which included the player because the player was mechanical and could be disassembled as bits, and then disassembling themselves, killing themselves instantly.
I love it. It's like just busy hands, like disassembling things and just continuing on themselves.
Yeah, just all the way up until you fall into a pile of scrap on the floor, right? Like, and that
it's
kind
like
of
the
stuff
Great Goo theory or something like that.
Yeah.
Made its way to the game. That is phenomenal. What about you, Jason? Is there something in particular that stands out to you as like outlandish or just nothing that could have happened in your wildest dreams?
I mean, one that I talk about a lot that I do love is, well, first of all, shout out to that one because that one's amazing, and in particular,
It's so good.
there's a 1 in 20,000 chance, I think it is, for any creature in the game to be mechanical, which is a fun, like, there's a whole design talk because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to say about that. But the lovely thing there is that that bug is enabled by this real core, actually is one of, I would say, the real core original design principles that very much, I think, influenced how Brian architected this system, which is that we really wanted all the creatures to be as fully modeled as the player, and to be those things to like have a lot of parity, like the creature objects and the player objects. And so that tag could just affect the player. And this was not really that wasn't intentional when we were thinking 1 in 20,000. We wouldn't be thinking 1 in 20,000 runs would mean that you start out as a mechanical player. But because the player bodies are just creature bodies, that happened with that. But it's very rare when it happens, right? And so it's kind of this blessed thing. I think at some point in the game, you couldn't tattoo yourself, which is very important, and because you were mechanical, and that so we had to add that
skin, right? Yeah, okay,
yeah. But anyway, that's great. But another thing that's really great is that we have mental mutations in our game. One of them is called domination, where you kind of like psychically project into someone's body and take over their body, and that again is enabled by this mechanism of like, well, the creatures are fully modeled, so if you project yourself into a spider's body, then you'll have control of the spider and you'll have your spider limbs and you can spin webs, etc. But it's a temporary thing. It's a mutation. It's balanced. We do care about balance and cut to some degree. And so like you do it for 200 rounds and then your time runs out and then you go back to your body. But there's a little trick that players came up with, which is that if you attacked your original body, and normally if you take damage, you're shunted back out to your original body. But if you can attack your original body and kill it in one hit so that there wasn't a moment where you could get shunted back, then you would be permanently trapped in the body of the thing you were dominating. And so people use that to play the game as all sorts of strange things, right? Oh, I'm going to permanently play the game as a goat because I can, dominate the goat. And then people are min-maxing it. Oh, well, what's the best? Well, you really want to get an apple farmer's daughter, a legendary one. They have the lowest level but the best stats. And so you can like level up and and so there's this whole meta around it, right? And we ended up turning it into a feature, so to speak, which is that it, we added enough code to support it without it. Like occasionally it would just crash the game, which is like not good. That's a type of bad bug, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so we added enough support so that you can do it. But we, because this is a really fun thing that I talk about. There's another talk I gave at Roguelike Celebration where I get into this, where like, part of the magic there is feeling like you transgressed against the game. And so
like you stepped outside of the game rules, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it has this really nice sort of rhyming with the actual in-game ability, which you are committing these psychic transgressions, like drawing from these mental powers that are like not well understood and potentially quite dangerous. So there's something fun about you kind of like flirting with the boundaries of the game systems themselves, right? And so when we were careful not to make it feel too much like not too, we didn't have the game over acknowledge you for doing that, because then it feels like, oh, this is something you expected a high level escort to do. Instead, we would kind of give this kind of cryptic message, which reads kind of like this console machine message, which is just like, oh, the game kind of, I did it. The game recognizes that I'm in this new body, but was I supposed to do that? Like, it's kind of unclear.
Fucking cool. That's awesome. So it's a really interesting notion hearing about this, like the emergence of this bug and discovering, that the mechanical trait could obviously, then affect players and things like that. And then this notion of something happening, but going, actually, let's lean into that and let's create a feature. It leads me to the question of where there's some moments in the game's development that directly came from the community, or maybe even yourselves playing the game, that made you think like, we all have them when we're developing it, but obviously you've had this community playing the game as well, right? And modding it and stuff too. But were there ever any moments that you heard of or you experienced yourselves where you're like, oh shit, like we're onto something, or these crazy ideas we've been trying to make, like you say, these two polar opposite things work together? And you spoke about that magical moment, Jason, where they do come together. Brian, is there something that you remember in a stage in development where you're like, oh fuck, we have something special on our hands, or it's working,
I don't know. I feel like it's been kind of iterative. I know Jason. I remember when Jason and our good friend Nick were playing, and they had some incredible, like, maybe you should tell this story, Jason, but they had some incredible encounter, and they were like,
this is it.
Is this the one with brains?
Like you and Nick.
Is this the one where we put the brains on the walls?
Oh, no, that's later. That's later.
Oh,
I feel like... Yeah,
sorry, not that one. Okay, you tell it like, oh, that one. Yes, I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
It's not the brains on the wall one.
Not the brains on the walls. Yeah, that one is just... That was the first moment where it was very early in the game's development. It was where our first playtester and early design collaborator, Nick DiCaprio, we were sitting at the computer. At this point, the three of us were the only people who have seen the game. And we just had this really nice encounter where we were at one hit point and then fleeing from a creature, and then our torch burnt down so we couldn't even see, but we could get to our equipment menu where we could load up our thrown weapon slot with random objects that we were just throwing in the direction we thought the monster was at. We ended up killing them that way because the collision of the there was enough thrown weapon logic in at the time to know that if you get hit with something sharp, even if it's not a weapon, you should take some damage. And so that was just the first moment where it felt that was an experience we had. That wasn't just a kind of prototype that we're walking around. That was something novel.
Yeah, the funny part is, I think we've been building QUD for so long, since in our 20s. I think it mirrors our own development as game designers and developers, right? And so these milestones are milestones of us going, I built an engine that could have a still suit in it that's a liquid volume and armor. Oh, that's awesome. That's a milestone. That's something, right? I can walk underground from one town to the dungeon, right? Wow, that's technically pretty cool. Wow, it played it as a whole game. We had a little adventure. Oh, we built Golgotha, which is one of the earliest dungeons where we really departed from standard roguelikes and started, having our own voice in terms of what QUD was going to put you through in terms of dungeons. Playing through Golgotha and realizing, oh yeah, we can do something different was amazing. The climax of Tomb of the Eaters really strikes me as a moment where the whole arc of the game, it kind of closes, right? And you get a lot of electricity from your path through the game. It recontextualizes a lot of stuff that's happening. And I think the climax of the Tomb of the Eaters was really the moment where I said myself, this game is saying something on its own successfully, right? It took us a long time to get here, but these pieces that we've kind of been building up, that circuit closed at the Tomb of the Eaters. And now the second act of the game, is kind of the finalization of that climax moment where we said, look, all these arcs that have kind of been going out, these particles that have been flying together, came back together, and it's telling a story, right? It's all these pieces are telling a single unified.
It's actually there. It comes together as a sum of its parts. Yeah,
that's right.
And it's Brian's being a little cagey about the specifics because it's extremely spoilery. We don't want to. But if you go experience that or read about it on the wiki if you don't want to. Or there's some good YouTube Let's Plays out there that you can watch other people having done it.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited to get further into the game because I've just heard such great things about how it does actually come together. But you did tap into something there that is, again, kind of unique to these long projects, right? When you guys started this as, youngins, right? And now we're sitting here and you're in the middle of your years or coming up to it, right? you're fundamentally different people, like physically and mentally and emotionally and everything. What kind of goes into this amount of development personally, and how do you like, I mean, I can't even, there's some writing that I did in my early 20s that I look at and I'm like, oh my God, I was such a better writer back then. But there's so much of it that I'm like, I cringe at seeing, right? Or like, I can't imagine working on one continued piece for so long. How do you, does the game obviously just become this reflection of you? And how do you sort of navigate working on a project for so long, emotionally and personally, or to just come naturally because it's a hobby that you're just interested into the whole time?
It's really tricky to answer that, because I think there are obvious ways in which the decisions we made in 2007, 2008, I think, like, are things that are difficult to reckon with now. Like, the main one I'll say is that, like, we made a super, at the time, like, exclusively combat oriented game. And then our interest as gamers and as people and as, thinkers, maybe matured beyond, I mean, I love it. Combat's fun, games are good at that. But I think we wanted to go, there was kind of like projections on the wall of what the game could do, and we wanted to lean more into that. And yet it sometimes was challenging to do that because the core loop is pulling you back into, whoa, well, you explored away and maybe spent some skill points on like a non-combat skill. Well, now you're dead because the game is built around this brutal combat loop.
Yeah.
And so, like, really, like fighting with that sometimes has been the most obvious one. But at the same time, like, sometimes people do say to us, like, oh, I can't imagine having worked on that long. And in some sense, like, when you step back and be like, yeah, what the hell's wrong with us? Like, but then in some ways, it's like, it just feels like maybe this is a way in which we're kind of broken or something, or raw, like it feels like, yeah, I mean, that will just happen if, time passes, and we, in some sense, it's just privilege. Like, it's a privilege to have this idea that we didn't have to set aside and like leave behind, that we would have really, that, like, probably happens hundreds and thousands of times a day, where people are setting things aside and not getting back to them. And we were able to come back to it. And that's kind of amazing and, like, beautiful. And it comes with its own hairiness to it, obviously. But I don't know. It's strange, but it is. Well, let me just stop there and see if Brian wants to say anything else about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously kind of reflects us growing for 20 years, the team growing from just us in the garage with our friends to now a vast community, right? Like, hundreds of people have contributed materially to QUD. And though QUD speaks to the kind of context collapse that happens when a whole society becomes embodied in a single sultan, right? And the actions of 1,000 people across a continent get collapsed to a single mountain in a state. And the same thing happens in QUD, inside people's heads, inside our own head, right? Where all of these influences, for years and years, people are playing this game and loving it and feeding their reactions back into our reactions, right? It's a dialogue with players. It's a dialogue with our friends. It's a real emotional journey, right? Like, we're volatile 20 somethings and now we're old, gnarled 40 somethings, and we've navigated, personal conflict. Like, we were both single and we started, and we're both married with kids now, right? Like, our ability to focus is necessarily diminished because now we're running a company instead of just working on a hobby. And so, like, there's no easy answer to it. It's been a huge journey. Some people make a dozen little things. I think, like, people ask me, what's your advice about making a big thing like this? And it's just, I think the reason why we succeeded at QUD is we found something that motivated us both, in addition to being privileged to be able to come back and meet that motivation, right? That motivated us to work through that difficulty, I wouldn't have been as motivated to work on a smaller project that was less ambitious, to come back
Yeah.
to work on a little thing that's like a web game, right? To work on this, something that's like so unlikely, but still maybe possible, right? Like if we work for maybe one more year, right? Like, we can maybe imagine it. That got me back to the desk, like every night for 30 minutes. And that's what really made it for me, right? Like that's what worked through the personal difficulties, what worked through the business difficulties, right? Just like that motivation, something really good that is meaningful to a lot of people, that's meaningful to me.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing you talk about, Brian, and I do honestly relate with that notion that sometimes the scale of the problem is also like a lot of its attraction and allure as well, right? It's like you say, likely impossible, but there is a slight chance of possibility. It's like, okay, sign me up. Let's have the waves crash against the rock because we know they'll win, in a million years or something like that, right? But there is one element of that that's, both of you talk about it, and which is what I asked. It's beautiful responses from both of you. I love it. The intrinsic motivation. How much of it was also this fact that you guys had released it into open beta so long ago. So, like you say, the quick throwaway of like 15 people or whatever, but it was a small community rallied behind this game, whether it was 15 or 150 or 1500 or whatever, right? How much of that was a pull there, or was it not really as much as, not to say that you don't appreciate them or anything like that, but it was just more intrinsically led for you? Or was there definitely an extrinsic pull of like seeing the result of your work and that 30 minutes at the desk every night that you say, Brian, actually then being able to release it at whatever cadence you were doing and seeing the impact and people engage with it and the modding community and that feeding into what you're doing?
I mean, I think, definitely a motivation, definitely a big, it's lovely. It's to connect with people that way and to have people connect with the game. I think, it's interesting. Like, I'm of two minds of it because I do think being able to, I think we were very locked in a lot of ways, and a lot of like, it's amazing to have thought of some of these initial ideas in 2007 and then be executing them in 2024, right? And there's something really special about that when it is like, that's kind of, a lot we didn't envision, but some of it is just like, that's what we kind of envisioned and that's what we're doing now. And I like that QUD is a sort of timeless project that for like logistic and for all sorts of reasons can resist the pressures to push it into a different space. At the same time, I think the motivation under this type of creation is connecting with other people in a large part in some way, and it's doing that, and it's special to see. It's been amazing, like even just the 1.0 launch, even though it is not like, it's different from going from no early access to launch than to early access to launch, because obviously people have been playing it, but like enough new people are playing it and talking about it that it feels different, right? It feels and I think something that I forgot is like, I've been with the game for so long, and like, I kind of didn't factor in the fact that, you're coming to it now, you're seeing the whole new UI, you're seeing the tutorials, you're seeing a lot of like the bad friction that we didn't like shaved away with the good friction that we like still there. And like, you're having a really interesting first experience with QUD, and it's so lovely to see that, like, because it's like, wow, I've never seen QUD received when it's been in a final form. I won't say the final form because it's never final, and we're going to keep working on it, and we have ways we really want to improve it. But to watch people come into contact with like the delivered thing it actually is surprising me how much of a new experience that is. I thought it was, it's going to be more people playing QUD. I've had that experience, but it is a little different.
The beauty is, and you are right, like your presumptions are right. Like, I've only been playing it since 1.0, so I have no idea and even like I see some of the old UI and everything, like a screenshot, I'm like, oh, whoa, okay, like like that or whatever. There's a really beautiful example that I found, because sometimes you're looking for something about QUD and there'll be a post from 9 years ago or 5 years ago, and if maybe it's still relevant or maybe it's not, but someone was asking something about books or whatever, and someone then jumped into the thread and said, the books, the white books, so in the game there's yellow books which are authored and then white books which are procedurally generated, right? And they were like, the white books used to be actual like full books, and now they're just a line of text. And I was like, what a brilliant example. Even before our conversation today, when I saw it, I was like, that is an example of you guys balancing that procedural content with, you know, how it's received and shaving friction off just one small element, right? It's like, okay, maybe these books, I'm, you know, putting words in your mouth. I don't mean to do that, but like, I'm assuming there was some process where it's like, maybe these books aren't coming together, you know, these Markov chains of words and everything in a way that is really effective as whole books. And we don't need to do that. We can just pull out a small little line and it's much more effective for the players. And that friction, as I said, I think it was, I don't know, this post was from like 4 or 5 years ago that I saw that someone was like, oh yeah, that decision, they're just single lines now. It's a great example of what you're just talking about. That I never interface with that. I never even thought that would be a possibility, or that you went through that, like these battles fought and won, you know, and and losses and everything that no one will ever know of, right? Like that people like me just come to the game and get it all packaged up at 1.0.
I love that. I love that people are able. I mean, that is the one thing I feel like we've been missing. Like, we've been having people play our game for so long, but we haven't had people play the packaged thing. And it's different and it's lovely.
Well, and it's amazing to me looking back over the last 20 years, because people are playing this RPG that like is half done. It doesn't have an ending, right? Like the UI doesn't work. Like what are they doing? Like, what were they doing the last 20 years? Why was anyone playing this game? Right? Like, oh yeah, I love Morrowind. I can get to Balmora and then that's the end of the game, right? Like whatever it is about the game made people say like, I can see the vision here, right? Like I just like it. They're not here for the story, though the story is important, right? Like they're not here for any individual thing. The people who come here and they just want to be a part of the world, right? Like they hang out in the place that is QUD, which is like the art and the writing and the music and and the other people in the Discord, right? Like they're just there to hang out. And you see this over and over again with people just want to come back and hang out in Skyrim still 10 years later, right? Totally. Like you just want the leaves start to turn and you just want to go back to this other world for a little bit. You want to go back to, you know, slip through the wardrobe. And I feel like people come to QUD for that more than anything.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's a game, even me only having played it for like the last 10 days or so, that I'm getting this feeling that it's one that I'm going to come back to, which is interesting because you've got the dailies and everything, right? Where folks can dive in and play this, you know, this generated seed of a run and a character and everything. It's really brilliant.
Well, I think for the last, I think speaking to that, for the last 10 years, we've been doing weekly updates, right? So people have been playing this game every week. They've got something a little new, and this is changing a little bit. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so I think going forward, that's something that will change a little bit, and we're still thinking about how we're going to do that, but still keep that kind of like world alive.
There's one topic that I do want to jump on before we leave, because, you know, we could talk for hours. There's so much to discuss about this game and obviously this incredible achievement that you've both managed to conjure over the last 17 years. But, you know, there's the saying in video games that 95% of the game is in the last 5%. So I can only imagine the horror of 16 years of that, and then the last 5% being, right, having to put like 95. How was that? How was coming into 1.0? And talk to me a little bit about like the game that existed before you were like, okay, and you obviously signed the deal with Tanya and you're like, it's happening, 1.0 is going to happen. What was kind of left on the table? What sort of villains revealed themselves from the shadows in regards to like, you know, design debt or tech debt or the challenges? You know, there's obviously the standard stuff of just getting a game publishing ready, you know, like, and ready to go, but actually taking an idea and a concept this grand and going, this is the game that is going to exist. What was involved in that challenge there, and how much of a battle was it to happen?
I feel my muscles like.
For people who are listening, Brian is just slowly shaking his head, and Jason, you could tell, just didn't want to lean into that question at all. It's written all over their faces.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you know, a thing we ran into is that we created this like maximalist, highly greeble world where part of the appeal is that every single object has a little bespoke handwritten description that was put a lot of love was put in all these systems, and even though there are a lot of like holes in the game, there's just so much. I've been saying it recently. It's like it's a big mess, but it's kind of a mess in an interesting shape. But what that means is one of the there were two main things that we were going to decided we were doing for 1.0. Now, three main things. Okay, there's the new UI, this whole new UI that's much more like RPG friendly. That is amazing achievement because it allows the game to be played on gamepad and Steam Deck, et cetera, et cetera.
It's stunning. It really is a remarkable achievement, really.
There's a little tutorial where just like we wanted to ease the funnel into the game a little bit. And then there was finishing the game, like the main quest done. And
okay, the main quest. I was like, just these two things, and then one small tiny thing. Yeah,
then one small tiny thing. Right. Then finishing draw the rest of the owl. No, I mean like particularly finish, like give the game an ending. You can beat it. All right.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay.
And just speaking to that last part, when we would come up with an idea and like then think it through and be like, oh, but it's just like the rest of the game is so. It's like you have this very intricately carved Corinthian column, right? And then you can't just have like a cap on it. It has to be an intricately carved like fancy cap for it to feel right. And so the ending had to be a lot. It had to be big and it had to be complex and it had to be. And so like it really, we gave a lot to get it to where it is. And I think we landed it. We're really proud of it, but boy, it was a lot to get there. And that's just speaking to that. And of course, like, I don't want to spoil it. But I think like in the same way that if you're listening and you've played maybe like the Tomb of the Eaters, in the same way that the Tomb of the Eaters, like, as Brian was saying, kind of like completes the circuit. I think the ending, once again, in my mind, like completes another circuit. Like I would say like the Tomb of the Eaters is the circuit kind of closing, and then the end blows out, right? Like it's the whole thing, but it's not a closing of a circuit, right? Like it's a sort of Big Bang experience, right? Like, and it was the whole team that we have been like, we talk about institutional knowledge in game dev a lot. Like the teams are often fractious. It's very difficult to keep a team together. This is now a team that's been working together for like a decade, like including me and Jason, obviously forever, but artists and musicians, additional writers, QA. We've been working together for years and years and years and years at this point. We just like know how each other thinks, right? Jason can write a vague description, and the tile artist Sam can write an amazing, just draw completely bizarre, multi-dimensional artifacts perfectly what Jason wants. And so this is the whole team just working absolute top of our game, old people, right? Like very good at what we do, making 2 hours of gameplay right at the end. And it's just like everybody went really extra on what you see in the last couple minutes, which is kind of the invert. QUD's kind of upside down from most games, where the opening areas are the most detailed and focused. And then as you get to the end, production budgets are done, right? You have to finish it and you're out. And so the ending is a rushed sketch. QUD's upside down. The deeper you get into the game, the weirder, older, and more dense we get as a team. And so by the time you walk at the beginning, you're like fighting Snapjaws in basic room hall dungeons. And at the end, other things are happening. You're walking out going like, right.
Well, I haven't reached that point yet, but like the foreshadowing from the community about how much the game just blows out in every particular way after a certain point is just, is really, really fascinating and alluring about even just being a part of the community as you're making your way through the game. Okay. And so we're sort of wrapping up here, coming in towards close. 17 years working on this kind of game and these really ambitious, very admirable, lofty goals, whether they be technical or design-wise, of like having roguelikes and RPGs like come together, or procedural generation and emergent narrative and authored narrative, or your aspirations for roguelike engines and, the different way that you're approaching that technically as opposed to how it's been done in the past. Can you each give me sort of one philosophy that you've come out of this from, like one major lesson that you would want to pass on, or even just something that you would hope that other folks in the game making community or the industry or design, that they would do in games, or that they would take more charge of, or, sort of really trying to wring the juice out of in games, what would it be after your experience in CUD and having gone through this and having, I haven't kept my cards close to my chest here. I really think it's a stellar, immense achievement, that you two have really come up with here with this game. It's honestly, I don't have words for it. It's mind blowing. And I think the Eurogame will be talked about for a long, long time to come. So I'm keen to hear, after you've come out the other end of it, what sort of you have on the stone tablets, coming down from the mountain.
Do you have any wisdom? I don't know if I have. I don't know if I've. Like, I think my takeaway is that I don't have any wisdom at all. Right? Like, this is just a lot of hard work. And like, I think.
Here, let me seed you with one that you've said before.
Okay.
For you, if you want it. Sure. I mean, and you started talking about it earlier. It was just like, often the advice for people when you hear game devs talk about.
Yeah. I think that's true. Like people will say, do small projects, right? Yeah. Do achievable projects. And for me, that's not true. What I tell everybody is like, do whatever motivates you to sit down, because that's the important thing, right? Like what got us to CUD was, I think, twofold. One was sitting down every day and making something that that interested us, right? Mm-hmm. And following it where it led. And the other was then like letting people in the door that like shared the passion over time, right? Like finding the people to collaborate with and letting them contribute. Like that family, like CUD wouldn't be what it is without all of the people on the team, without like Kit Fox showing up and saying, we want to promote you because you literally have never promoted your game before, right? Like all of these people showing up and letting them in the door, contributing to the work, because games more than anything is syncretic. Right? Like you cannot make a game as a person, because it's like you need to be a playwright, you need to be a visual artist, you need to be author a whole album of music, you need to be a technical wizard, right? Like you can't do that as a person, right? Like you do that as a team of people. Everybody does that as a team of people, and that like finding the right people and understanding them as human beings is just like so important to shipping of any video game, more than any other kind of work of art, I think.
Love it. Jason?
Yes, that is. So yeah, I mean, I would say, like, I guess, I think I alluded to it earlier, like, obviously when you're making games, generally often you have someone who's kind of breathing down your neck, whether it's a publisher or like other stakeholders, right? A lot of games are made in that context, in a very like embedded in capitalism context, and it shapes the products that come out of it necessarily. Like there's a context to all art that's made. And so there's like, I definitely don't like to be flippant about this, because you're not like, you don't go and tell a designer who's working at, I don't know, like get whatever game studio, like, why aren't you taking more risk? You're not being bold enough. Like, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why they're not taking risks.
Yeah.
But I think generally it is, I do sometimes feel like we fall into a pattern where we forget that games can be made outside of these pressures, or at least like, holding those pressures back a bit, right? Like, and so you might make, and where this comes up for me in particular is like a lot of the friction that we have, like we were talking about in our game. I think people would write off and say is like, well, you can't do this like when you're making a game of a certain scale, and that's maybe true, but like forgetting that for a moment, I think friction can be really good. I know that there's a designer, Droken, Alexander Martin. They made like, Starseed Pilgrim and Probability Zero. Really great design thinker, in my opinion. They're on this kick right now where they're saying kill gameplay, which I think, I haven't actually talked to them about it, but like, I think what I've read of what they're saying is we've become so good as an industry, even the design practices of like knowing what good gameplay is and what good game design is, and creating these like frictionless sometimes experiences that get the most people into the most important the game as quickly as you can, and you have all the elements that do that. And what's lost there is that like games are not just the sort of like expert craft at its highest level of execution. They actually are their personal expressions, their communal expressions, and sometimes the weird and the frictionness, the kind of roughness are part of what is making the experience special. And I think, there's a lot of deep there's a lot of deep reflection that goes into what is the good friction that you mean, and what is the bad friction that you don't mean, and what is the good friction that you don't mean, and what is the bad friction that you mean. There's all sorts of combinations there that make this question one like a very tricky one, and make design and the creation writ large difficult and also worthwhile, right? And so but just to resist some of the pressures that are really making you produce something that fits really cleanly into your genre, and to like maybe think about where those resistances like produce meaning in what you're making, both for you and for people playing your game, if that kind of makes sense.
It does. And both of the things that you've said, or the things that both of you have said, they were peppered throughout our entire conversation, right? And it does feel like this brilliant culmination, not just of what we've been talking about, but these 17 years. So I applaud you for both what you're saying. There's a whole other tear that I could go on about gameplay and that phrase, and it actually originating in video game magazines as a way for them to like create numeric scores, and this thing that they weren't able to put a label. Like, there's a whole history there that is crazy, and it's wild to think about the impacts that it has on us as developers and the industry and our actual medium and hobby. But we don't have time for that. We won't go into that, but it's absolutely, I love what you're putting down, both of you. In closing, because we are going to close, like I said, I haven't kept my cards close to my chest. I love Caves of QUD. I think it's absolutely stellar achievement across so many axes. But there is one thing that really stands out to me, not particularly better than the rest, but like it is my favorite thing about the game, and it is the flavor text. And it's doing so much heavy lifting in this game that it is incredible. And to the point where I'm looking at everything and reading it. And I'm going to end here, because if you've been listening to this game and you really want to know what some of the allure is, and you're just like, you want more, or it to be spelled out and laid out for you, I'm going to tell you one of the first points when I fell in love with Caves of QUD, and it was reading two particular pieces of flavor text. I'm going to read them for you now. The first one is an enemy that you meet in the first dungeon that most players are likely to play. Not an enemy, sorry, I should say a character that you meet at the bottom of this dungeon. And they're called the Gaia White of Agolga. And this is their flavor text when you inspect them. It says, a figure is marked by star orchid robes as a votary of the Gaia and reveler in the metamorphic Newman. Nails filth black flash from out their sleeve in a gesture poem to say that plague is but transmutation. Death is the ladder to life, and the existence of children proves the prelacy of raw growth. A rank and acrid smell clings to them. I almost fell off my chair when I wrote that. I was like, I think you just you put the hooks in me, and I was in for guaranteed another 20 to 30 hours just off the back of that. And then my other favorite one I'm going to read is the most simplest, most beautiful piece of flavor text I think I've read in any game. And it's just the flavor text for a small boulder. And it simply says, it's a piece of rock older than every idea. Amazing. It's incredible stuff. So with that, and in absolute thanks for your generosity in sharing your incredible tale, I do want to congratulate you too, not just on the success of your, obviously tech and design and cultural achievement here, but the commercial success of somehow not really having any commercial aspirations whatsoever, on this hobby that just brought you back to the desk for 30 minutes every night, and the ability to continue on and perpetuate your creative and financial independence for however long into the future. I applaud you, and I'm just so happy that you're just getting so many more players who are able to experience this incredible thing that you've built. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It's been a wonderful chat.
Yeah, awesome. Absolutely. Feel honored to be here and to be able to talk about the game and to have so many people playing it.
Likewise, gentlemen. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll speak to you again sometime.